Hey, yo, what's up, guys? We got a special guest on today. We got the Madeline Pendleton, absolute great TikTok creator. She owns a clothing brand, fashion creator. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I don't know what I would say. Who am I?
You're also a financial advisor, sort of.
Oh God, I guess. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I really enjoy your content. I enjoy everything that you do. You're anti-capitalist, you're communist. Oh, what would you describe your ideology as?
I'm a Marxist. I'm a communist. And that always trips people out when they hear I own a clothing brand, but we run it on like a socialist, principles. So it's not a traditional capitalist business structure, even though we obviously have to exist within capitalism.
Of course, of course. And also you're a West Coaster like me, so, a Californian like me, and a
Central Valley.
Central Valley, yeah, we're both from the Central Valley. What was your journey to becoming a communist? Was it shaped by growing up in the Central Valley specifically, or
Okay, yeah, kind of actually. So, when I was 13, I started going to punk shows in Fresno, and we had like a pretty healthy punk scene for maybe 2 years that I was going. And everything eventually got shut down by the cops. But it was like an old school punk scene. So there'd be a lot of literature. We had a pretty active Food Not Bombs, but it was all anarchists. So
Mm.
I was an anarchist because that's like the initial, I guess, punk rock political education you get. But even as an anarchist, I remember we like definitely read Marx. We read the Communist Manifesto. So that was kind of part of the education as well. And then I would say that I called myself like an anarcho communist for probably 4 or 5 years. And then eventually just dropped the anarcho thing. It was like, nah, fuck it, full blown commie mode. But yeah, a lot of that happened around Fresno, and most people don't know this, but there's actually a pretty healthy history of left wing political activism in Fresno. So after 9/11 in 2001, that's when I was 13 and I was going to punk shows and stuff. We had a really healthy anti war movement pop up. We had this organizing group called Peace Fresno, and they would put on anti-war protests, and we would have a lot of really prominent left-wing political thinkers come to Fresno to attend our protests and speak at them beforehand. So we had like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a pretty famous prison abolitionist, who would come speak, and obviously Cesar Chavez, would come. So there is kind of like this weird Central Valley history of activism that I think a lot of people overlook.
Yeah, you were alive when Cesar Chavez was still alive? When did he die?
When did Cesar Chavez die? I think let me look this up.
Because he's a legend in my town, and
Yeah, obviously.
he has
So
problem at 1993. So yeah.
1993.
Yeah, so he has, like, problematic aspects of him, but of course everybody still loves him, yeah.
Totally, yeah, very and especially later in life. I feel like a lot of people who have, like, political activism going on in their, like, 20s, later in life, you're like, "Oh, what's happening here? Okay, ha ha. Interesting."
You're
Like,
like
kind of a
you look
life
a little
came to
bit
her.
deep you look a little bit deeper into your heroes, and it's just like, they weren't the best, especially his, anti-migrant stance and everything, but that's very cool that you met him, that's very cool that you were active. I think the Central Valley is very overlooked in terms of political, uh, activism and everything in California because it's so underdeveloped and everybody just sort of writes it off as, like, inherently right wing, but there's a lot of migrant labor here, there's a lot of people who can be radicalized, especially poor, like, rednecks and things like that. Like, if you just talk to them, I think big city liberals, they just have I sound so much like a redneck when I'm saying like that, the big city liberal. But big city liberals really do so often just write off like rural people, rural folk as like stupid and backwards when in fact they can become class conscious if you treat them like a human being.
Yeah, and I think, like, in Fresno because, Fresno's unique. It's a little bigger than Bakersfield. It's like, 500,000 people. It's a pretty big city. It's considered a minority majority city because the predominant kind of demographics there skew, I guess, Latino is the term people use, but growing up in Fresno, people don't like it when you use that term, so it was kinda trained out of me. But yeah, it's a lot of people who have this very working class background and this working class identity, and they have, like, a cultural tradition that's inspired by a lot of Chicano labor activism already. So I think, yeah, people don't really know how to position Fresno. It's a unique experience growing up there because you're surrounded by farmland. So obviously, like the rural politics of farming are very influential in how we live our lives. But at the same time, it's very like urban city center, which most people don't really understand either. So it's kind of like A unique beast, yeah, and, like, I just a correction, I didn't personally meet Cesar Chavez, but the history of him, like, coming to Fresno and doing speeches and stuff like that was, like, a legacy that our kind of peace organizing and advocacy groups and political advocacy groups there
Mm.
carried on, so I didn't mean to imply that I met him when I was a wee child, but that history is something in Fresno that people talk about a lot and carry through with a lot of political organizing, yeah, in general.
Okay, okay. My bad. My bad for inferring that. And then you've talked before about, growing up sort of couch surfing with your parents. Your parents were in this sort of like punk scene. Did that shape your communist views at all?
I mean, definitely. So, my dad raised me by himself pretty much until I was 12. And my dad was like a punk rocker when I was born. So, we kind of struggled financially because he was super young. I think he was like 19 or 20 when I was born, and he had a lot of odd jobs. He worked as a drug dealer, he worked as a bouncer. For a while, he was a sprinkler salesman, maybe.
Mm.
And we would end up having to stay with my grandparents a lot because we wouldn't have places to live. We'd get evicted, things like that. And then, when I turned maybe 13, my dad's, like, financial situation super fell apart in this really catastrophic way. So I went to go live with my mother, and my mother had been always more financially stable. By that point, I would say that she was, like, comfortably middle class, but we had so much conflict between us, it was, like, not a suitable living environment for me. So I would get kicked out of the house a lot and have nowhere to go. And my dad was homeless when I was in high school. So I would be homeless for months as well, like with nowhere to end up. And I remember this one night I had a place I could stay. It was a woman who owned a vintage store in town. And she was like, "You can come stay at my house tonight in the guest room." And I was like, "Oh my God, this is so nice." And I remember I got there and she was like, "You have to leave tomorrow though, because I told your dad he could stay here tomorrow." So, like, my dad and I basically bounced around the Tower District, which is this neighborhood in southern Fresno, just staying at whoever's place would let us. And it was funny because we never stayed places together, but we would end up staying at like the same spots. And I think for him, his period of being, like, homeless basically was longer than mine, because I would have these, like, intermittent spots where I'd be allowed to go back home to my mom's house, but then it would only be for a couple weeks, and it would be a crisis basically every time I was there. So, I think that, like, the community-minded element of it, like, the Tower District is very community minded neighborhood. Everybody kind of knows each other. Everybody knew me. Everybody knew my dad. That played a significant role, I think, in shaping my politics and how you take care of each other and you look out for each other. And on top of that, too, just this idea of like what it meant to be homeless was very interesting to me because I don't think I realized that my dad and I were homeless until I was like 30.
Mm.
You know, I was reading actually a definition about hidden homelessness, and I was like, "This isn't actually homelessness. This is like what happened to me and my dad." And then I was like, "Oh my god, holy cow, we were homeless. Oh." And then I talked to my dad about it, and he was like, "Yeah, I guess you couldn't have stayed with me because I didn't have a place to stay." And I was like, "Yeah, Dad, we were homeless." And he was like, "Holy shit, we were homeless, weren't we?" So it's like just very interesting how you learn to position yourself later on in life in these kind of categories that don't make sense to you while you're doing it. So yeah, at the time you're just like, yeah, we're couch surfing. It's fine in orbit of each other. But later you're like, oh, that was gnarly actually. Wow.
Yeah, in the moment, it didn't seem that bad particularly, but, like, reflecting on it, yeah, I think a lot of people, like, when they think of homelessness, especially in California, it's like being out on the streets, and, of course, we do have a lot of that, but I've met plenty of folks who have been living out of their cars or, like, living out of, like, a friend's basement or something, and I especially with housing prices here recent times, it's just getting, uh this is sort of a hidden homelessness. I mean, I think that's a very nice, accurate term to describe it. Um Oftentimes, communists refuse to take any financial advice because it's so mired in like capitalist propaganda. But you wrote a book called I Survived Capitalism and All I Got Was This Lousy T-shirt. How did you balance that like capitalist propaganda with like financial advice? How did you find that like little middle point where you could actually give people financial advice to escape poverty?
Okay, so this was actually a really hard thing for me to wrap my head around too. And I kind of realized that it benefits nobody for me to be a martyr. So I grew up like, my dad financially unstable, like house she did manage to buy a house at one point, got foreclosed on. We were, yeah, like I said, getting evicted all the time. Money management, not my dad's strong suit. My dad's an amazing person, an amazing parent, but that just wasn't a reality I grew up with anyway. I say we grew up because he was like only 20 when I was born or whatever, and he was kind of growing up too. My mom was a little bit more financially responsible, and she did teach me some random things. Like she taught me about like credit scores, but the understanding I had was that like debt was inevitable. You know, you were always going to be in a perpetual state of debt, and the least you could do is make sure your credit score was okay. So I think there is this like instinct when you're a communist, when you're a Marxist, to reject the idea of financial austerity. And there's like a political motivation twofold to do it. First of all, you see what financial austerity does to countries when it's imposed by like the IMF and the World Bank, and you're like financial austerity gets you nowhere. But second of all, there's that like Marxist idea that you should be living your life. You should be enjoying your life. That somehow it's an act of rebellion to get drunk and go dancing, right? There's like a great Marx quote about how he likes to spend his money. And pretty famously, Marx was bad with money, right? We've all seen the letters where he's writing to Engels like, "Oh my God, sorry about your wife being sick. Can you send money? I'm broke." And like so we see this idea of financial struggle like politically as being very obviously the result of capitalism, right? Poverty is not accidental, it's intentional, it's a policy decision. People are poor because of policy decisions, and it doesn't have to be this way. And you get like justifiably and righteously angry, right? Because you look at your financial situation, you think about your stress and your struggle, and you understand like rich and powerful people, the owning class, the bourgeoisie, right? Like they are enforcing this lifestyle on you. They are doing this to you. It is a conscious decision, and it's hard not to get mad. And the idea that you should do something different by trying to control your own finances better is almost like a slap in the face. So I think I had that mentality for a really, really long time. I knew I was broke and struggling. I had massive amounts of debt, and it felt cruel to ask me on top of dealing with the stress of being poor to just manage my money better. Um, and I think the thing that really was a turning point for me in understanding money was learning that Karl Marx owned stock and really stopping to think about like the stock market in particular and what it was, and understanding like stock as public ownership of business, and understanding that under capitalism obviously the way our stock market works is as a wealth hoarding tool for the wealthy to acquire more wealth, right? But also understanding that in a system where you don't have the commie revolution happening tonight, probably unless there's some secret like signal chat I don't know about, you're gonna have to survive this somehow. And what can you do that helps your situation now so that you don't have to be a complete martyr? And so I started thinking about that. I started thinking about the stock market under capitalism and how it is the closest option we have to public ownership, and how maybe investing in the stock market isn't evil. And I started learning more about like the American retirement system. And then I started thinking about home ownership. And I started thinking about like home ownership in particular as being more, achievable than what people tell you. And I think home ownership and the idea of retirement being achievable, like, despite it all, really became like a "fuck you" motivating factor to me. And I had a friend come over to this apartment I was renting that was $1,500 a month, and it was like 300 square feet, and at the time, the business was just me, and I was working out of there and living out of there. And I remember having to tell my friends that I had a fat phobic hallway because the hallway was so small, anybody over like a size medium couldn't go down it to get to my bathroom. And this apartment was just kind of miserable. And one of my friends came over and was like, "Why don't you just buy a house?" And I remember thinking she was so out of touch. And I was like, "I don't have money to buy a house." And she was like, "You don't need money. Like, I own a house. I bought a house with $0 down and like a 600 credit score. Like, you could probably do it. And your mortgage would be about what you're paying now." And I thought she was out of her mind. And I started looking it up, and I was like, "Holy shit, it's like easier to buy a house than it is to rent now." And then I started getting really angry because I felt like that information was being gate kept from poor people. Like we were constantly being hit with this reinforcement of this idea that it would be impossible to ever buy a house. And the more I looked into it, I was like, obviously, the commodification of housing is deeply evil and it should not be this way. But what I came to understand is that we were already paying the high costs of housing just by paying high amounts of rent. And the rent was often higher than what the owners of the property, the landlords, were paying on the mortgage. And that's how they were making profit off of it. And once I started looking into that and seeing that like your credit score requirements to purchase a house are lower than your rental requirements, you can usually move in with $0 down in most areas. If it's an urban area, you only need 3.5%. And I started doing the math and I realized that if I wanted to move into a different one bedroom apartment in LA, then the amount of money I would feasibly be paying for a down payment on a house to purchase would be the same as a deposit to rent. And when you purchase a house, your first month of your mortgage is free. So it's like you recover part of that pretty quickly. So I started looking all into this and I realized that there were certain tools of like what more right wing people call quote unquote financial literacy that actually are super advantageous for people to learn. So, yeah, I don't know. That was kind of like the radicalizing journey where I was like, oh, I could own a house. Oh, I could have some public ownership of companies. And I don't think it like benefits any of us to ignore those things or not pursue those things because they actually are pretty left wing ideas, as much as you can get within a system of capitalism anyway. And yeah, now like I bought my house as a HUD designated very low income person, right? That's what the HUD has these very embarrassing income designations.
Mhm.
And it's way cheaper than what I was paying in rent. And my down payment was, very, very affordable for me as well. So I think like learning about this stuff was radicalizing in its own way. And, I think my reaction to it was just like, okay, and it's an additional tool of poverty policy to not let low income people know that they might still have these other options, basically, is how I came to interpret it. Like telling poor people you will never own a house is is another way of enforcing that we all are a nation of renters. And that actually doesn't help anybody but like the landlord owning class. Whereas the idea that you could say instead, like, housing should not be commodified. It is fucked up that we exist under the system, and this is what you have to contend with. However, given that, there might be situations where you can purchase a house and say fuck you to landlords and not have to pay a landlord anymore. And it's not perfect and it's not great, but it is something. I think that was the motivating thing for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot about your answer that I liked, and you're absolutely right that under like the way that financial literacy advice is often given, it's simply just like it's your personal fault that you're poor. Why don't you just budget your way out of not being paid enough? But you were able to find ways to survive under capitalism and even thrive a little bit. That I think everybody should be able to do as long as capitalism is around. I mean, we have to admit at some point that as communists, we don't have to unnecessarily suffer under the system if there are alternatives and ways out. As long as we're not, of course, exploiting other people, as long as we're not, being capitalists ourselves, if we can find alternatives to keep our heads above water and even enjoy life a little bit, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, the point of capitalism, like you said, is to keep us miserable as much as possible. The Marx quote you were talking about was Marx said, "The less you eat, drink, buy books, and go to the theater or balls or pubs, the less you love theorizing, singing, the greater your treasure and near month nor rust, your capital will become." Like he's basically saying they're turning you into like somebody who just watches paint dry all day. Like that's this goal of capitalism. It's such a horrible thing. Um Reading your book, and I haven't finished it, by the way. I should just give a disclaimer. I've skimmed it, but it's very good from what I've skimmed. Reading your book, it's very personal. Yeah, you weren't afraid to go into very personable details. It shocked me how different it was from the average financial literacy advice book, right? It was very tailored to your life and how you got out of your circumstances. What was your thought process in writing it?
So, okay, I didn't want to write a book about myself, but I was approached to write a book, and the idea was that people thought my life was interesting. And this has always been funny to me because I'm like, I don't think my life is interesting at all. I think my life is the same as the life of every other person I know. Um, so what I wanted to do was write a book about systems because that's how I view the world. I view the world in systems, not individual decisions, right? And my book publishers were like, "Nobody's gonna read that. Like, that's boring. That's dry. It has to be about you." So the way we ended up structuring the book is, it goes in chronological order of my life, and I tell a little story, a personal anecdote about something going on in my life in a period, and then I do an expanded view of how my experience is a microcosm of like experiences Americans in particular, Gen Z or millennials especially have had that are similar. And then at the end, it's like what I learned to kind of manage
Mhm.
dealing with that financially. So I kind of did this multi-step process, and there were certain things I knew I wanted to express. I wanted to express how certain individual experiences I had had were part of these larger systems and were particularly the result of capitalist policy decisions and how alternatives were possible. But within the book, we also had very conscious decisions made, like, we don't use the S or the C words. We don't say socialism, we don't say communism, right? And that was intentional to reach a larger audience. So it became more focused on key ideas of capitalism and how to express frustration with those in a way that didn't alienate people. And yeah, I don't know. That was kind of like the process. But the book I wanted to write is very different than the book I was approached to write because I was pitched this basically. And as a result, there was like a lot of funny editing stuff that happened. Like I had this whole chapter about 9/11 that my editor was like, "Absolutely not. What the fuck is this?" And I had to remove it. But I got to keep in some stuff about like military recruitment at my high school and how because I lived in a poor neighborhood, we never had college recruiters come, but we had military recruiters come, often. So these kinds of things like were worked in, and it would be like, okay, here's my experience dealing with military recruiters at my school, and then like here's an expanded view that's like this is what was going on with the military industrial complex at the time. These are the wars we were waging. This is like the results of imperialism and how that related to like poor students being told our only opportunity was to become wartime fodder for the imperialist capitalist war machine. And then in the end, figuring out like, okay, well, if I don't want to do that as a poor person realistically, what are my options for my future? And then trying to figure out how to go to college, So it would be like that kind of structure. And then, of course, the next chapter is how I got scammed by a for profit college because I was a poor person without a lot of understanding of how college worked. And it just kind of goes through my life like that, which is funny because every chapter is like dunk after dunk after dunk, of me just getting fucked with
Yeah.
by the system. But yeah, that was kind of like the structure and how we came to it. It was like a compromise. We had to talk about me a little bit because my publishers thought that would sell it. And then we got to talk about the systems and the structural stuff I liked a little bit. And then we had a little bit of what they call a prescriptive, like here's some advice on how to manage these things if you're in the same situation.
Yeah, it's I think it makes the book a lot more accessible, a lot more relatable. I mean, when I'm reading like I've read like one or two financial literacy advice books, and they're very boring and technical, and sometimes I can't even relate to them. It'll be like you got to invest $40,000 into the stock market, and it's just like I don't have that kind of who has that kind of money. But your book, I found it very the parts I skimmed. I'm not done with it completely yet, but I found it very personable. I found myself relating to a lot in it. I could see my teenage cousins picking it up and like understanding what's going on. Where were you during 9/11, by the way? I think one of our mutuals asked that question.
Oh, so, okay, I was in high school. It was my freshman year of high school, and I was ditching class. And I remember my mother called me. I was at her house at the time, and she was like, "Madeline, turn on the television, turn on the television." And I was like, "What?" And I like went to the living room, turned on the TV, and I was like, "Oh shit!" And it was like literally the first plane had hit the tower,
Okay. So
And I remember
you did not do 9/11
I
as
did not
okay.
do 9/11, although I do wanna make pin packs at some point that are all the best rumors and lies I've seen about me on the internet, even the exaggerated ones that people do in jest, which are my favorite ones, and Madeline Pendleton hit the second tower is my favorite one I see so far. That I'm just like, "This is perfect. This is peak comedy." So I'm on the phone, though, with my mom, and the first thing I say is I'm like, "Well, what did we expect would happen?" And my mother was like, "What the fuck does that mean?" And I'm like, we literally like spend our free time destroying every country around the planet. Like, did we think nobody was going to come for us? Like, hello. And I didn't have any of the details or anything. I just like looked and I knew. I was like, oh, this is a direct reaction to our foreign policy, fucking somehow. And then as I'm on the phone with my mom, obviously the second tower gets hit. And she's just like, fuck you, Madeline, and hangs up. And I'm like, well, whatever. And so I remember, like, I don't think I went to school until later in the afternoon because I would ditch class a lot. But I remember that System of a Down, Serge from System of a Down wrote this whole thing on the System of a Down blog maybe the next day.
Mm.
And I read it because even though I was a punk rocker, I secretly really liked System of a Down still because their lyrics were like very political. And I read it and he was kind of breaking down the cause and effects politically of why this happened. And I was like, okay, yeah, I got to learn so much more about what the United States has been up to, you know, in regards to Osama bin Laden, like, what was going on. And I just started like reading. I just started going on at the time. I think it was like I was still an anarchist, right? So I went on Noam Chomsky's website. I was like, I'm going to learn about this. But yeah, that was like my experience with 9/11. And then, you go to school the next day or whatever, and all the teachers are wheeling in these really old 2001 televisions with the huge backs, not flat screens. And they live on these giant carts and they plug them into a wall. And we just like keep rewatching the footage in every class, which is just so bizarre and surreal. And you see like people jumping out of buildings. And when you read about people who escaped, like it's bad. It was a bad death. And I always think like, oh man, that's so ass to hate your job and go to your job one day and you're just like, cool, my shitty ass government fucked with people in an entire region of the world I've never been to. And I'm at my shitty ass job today. And now my building is exploding and I'm dying a painful death, melting onto metal and glass because there's no escape route. And like that's how people died. And you read that and you're like, damn, I'm fucking sympathetic. And you see people like jumping out of the windows, and you're like, this is fucked up and horrible. And there's no denying that, but just like the indignity of being like, this is my shitty ass death at my shitty ass job because my shitty ass government couldn't help but fuck with other countries in the name of like 12 rich dudes here getting richer. It just feels like such a fuck you. So, we're watching this and I'm already a little politically radicalized as a freshman in high school or whatever. And it's just getting replayed over and over and over again. And then you're going to these assemblies at school where they're talking about the terrorists and George W. Bush is on TV talking about weapons of mass destruction. And, you're just like living in this surreal, weird hell. And there's a bunch of stuff too that happened at the time that I think a lot of people, if you weren't there, like you don't remember. Like within the first week after 9/11, we renamed French fries Freedom Fries. Do you know about this?
Yes, I've heard of it.
Yeah. Okay. How old are you? I don't know how old you are.
25.
Oh, okay, yeah, all right. So we renamed French fries Freedom Fries because the United States was instantly like, we got to go to war with everybody. And the war that we pitched was the war on terror, not even a place, just this abstract idea, which is like, hello, the United States government is the biggest terrorist on the fucking planet. What does this mean? But whatever, we're the war on terror, which just means, hey, we're going to indiscriminately invade and bomb every region in what we call the Middle East possible. And France was one of the first countries to be like, we're not backing you on this. And the whole United States was like, fuck France. So everything in the United States for like 6 months became anti France, and all of the French fries were renamed Freedom Fries. I mean, it was just like this surreal parody of Americana. And then on the flip side, you have all this like really gnarly policy shit coming out. I mean, we didn't have TSA before 9/11. You could just walk up to the gate at an airport. So all of a sudden, we get TSA coming out of this. We get all this weird Homeland Security bullshit coming out. We get the Patriot Act, like all of these new policy things coming out that are just bizarre and surreal. And then you have also this like sudden surge of hate crimes against anybody brown. And Americans are fucking stupid, right? So the people who were targeted the most were Sikh people because Americans are so dumb. We thought Sikh people were Muslim and we thought all the Muslims were doing it. And it was like some Islamic thing in particular, and not the result of our foreign policy. It's just like all these like cascading effects. So the probably the 5-year period after 9/11, which shaped all of my high school years, my teenage years, and even going into community college was some of the most bizarrely surreal, like parodies of American patriotism playing out around you. And you want to laugh at it, but like also, it's so violent, right? Like it's kind of like when you read about the CIA coup attempts and you're like, this is a comedy of errors, comma, but then 100,000 people died. It's like that. You're like, our country is so fucking laughably ridiculous, comma, but then all of these innocent people are being attacked by like weird racists on the street who think that they're doing something for America. I don't know. It was just obviously then we see the effects of the war on terror where it's like millions of people are displaced, hundreds of thousands of civilians are killed. Just horrifying. So, very, very strange kind of era to become politically conscious in and be a teenager in because I mean, it's ridiculous. It's laughable, but it's also so destructive and violent. And I remember going to all of these like Peace Fresno anti-war protests in my teenage years. And there would be a handful of us standing on the corner, if you are familiar with Fresno, on Blackstone and Shaw. And you would have like very conservative white Americans with megaphones screaming in your face that you were a shield for Saddam Hussein. That's like what they would be yelling in your face. And you would just watch these people like eating up propaganda. And it was like this crash course in understanding that the truth doesn't matter, the message is everything. And you're watching the effects of just a narrative play out all around you politically, locally with your neighbors. And it's like, how do you combat this massive misinformation propaganda machine going on right now? And you really feel helpless. So yeah, it was a very, very strange experience, 9/11.
Yeah, I think for a lot of millennials, 9/11 and George Bush in general and the Iraq War, Afghanistan, I mean, these were just linchpin moments for them to become radicalized, really see that a lot of the narratives that were told about America are kind of bullshit, that America isn't what it's chalked up to be. And of course, it's also that age-old adage that, leftists always get proven right, or tankies or whatever you want, always get proven right even when other leftists are yelling at them, like overthrowing Saddam will be bad. And, everybody got proven right when ISIS filled the power vacuum left by Saddam, or overthrowing Gaddafi will be bad. And we got proven right when now Libya has slave states, or even most recently overthrowing Assad will be bad. And most recently the government. Um, it's very odd the way that we interact with 9/11, because millennials, it's such a traumatic big part of your lives. For Gen Z, it's just a meme, right? Like it's
Yeah.
just Mordecai and Rigby from Regular Show posted into the plane going towards 9/11, or, just a SpongeBob edit. 9/11, the plane hitting the first tower with like SpongeBob music over it. It's such, but I think part of this Gen Z memification 9/11 is it's just like 9/11 revealed how ridiculous American society is, just how much of a comedy routine everything we know about our society is. And even though it is so fucking funny, like, you cannot create a civilization more hilarious than what America is. People very often have to pay the consequences for our own slapstick, like our own degenerate comedic society. And it's very often innocent people in the Middle East or Africa or Latin America, or what have you, like foreign people. Um, but yeah, no, it's very George Bush, 9/11, I mean, I think that's really what really you can point towards as, like, the beginning of the end of the American empire in a sort of ways. Like, America had gotten a second wind from the collapse of the USSR. It had almost all everything on Earth. It had, like, a grip on the globe, and then 9/11 happens and America eats itself by invading Iraq and Afghanistan. We've ended up spending trillions of dollars, and what happened was almost every one of our institutions went towards war. Our educations got defunded, our roads got defunded, and we spent this ridiculous amount of money. It's just a linchpin moment for just a lot of things. But for me, it's still, SpongeBob memes. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's totally true. I think, like, I mean, to us, it was some of us, it was ridiculous too. I mean, it is parody. But like you said, it's like people pay the price with their lives for our bizarre fucking dystopian slapstick humor. And it's hard to reconcile. And that's the thing too, when I'm watching people jump out of buildings, I'm like, "Man, that's a fucking bad day at work," you know? It's like not. That's that's just the victims within the Imperial Corps. We had 3,000 of them, and it's like, well, amplify that by what we're doing 9/11s around the globe every fucking day, you know?
No, absolutely. I mean, we did the first 9/11 in 1973. Yeah, it's very odd that 9/11 lingers in our memory so much, but then anytime we do something horrible to other people, we're just sort of like, get over it, right? Like, we had like about 3,000 deaths from 9/11, and then we'll kill like a million Iraqi people and force millions to flee, and we're just sort of like, get over it, cupcake. Like, we gave you freedom or something. It's so odd how conservatives too have sort of turned around now, and they're like, yeah, yeah, the Iraq invasions were bad, but our new invasions are good. Like, it's always the current war that's good, and the last one was a fuck up. It's, I don't know. That's just Americanism, I suppose. Um,
Totally.
Moving on, you run a company, it's called Tunnel Vision, but you're still a communist. And you were talking about this a little bit, but how did you structure your company in a way that it didn't misalign with your values?
Okay, so I tried some things first that did not work. I think I talked about this in the book. Like, I tried to take some like socialist ideas. When the company got to a point where I started to need help, the biggest problem I ran into is a lot of my friends needed work and they'd be like, "Oh, yeah, you need help. I need work. Like, let me just work for you." And the funny thing is like I'm like I'm one part like a Marxist, but bigger than that, I'm like a trashy LA party kid. So my friends aren't communists. Like I'm the one commie in the room. So when my friends show up, they're like, nah, man, just like pass me $50 and let me smoke some weed here. It'll be cool. I'll just ship orders. And I'm like, you don't understand. I can't do that because that's exploiting your labor. They're like, what? So this is like the thing I've always tried to deal with. So I'm always trying to figure out these like ways that it can be ethical or fair. And I came up with these ideas in the beginning that did not fucking work. Like I came up with one where it's like, okay, like we all work at the company and the number of hours you put into the company, you're allowed to sell whatever you want yourself on the company website. And in my head, I was like, this seems fair. This is like worker co-op vibes. But what ended up happening is that I like did hyper capitalism somehow. And then all of a sudden, everybody was like working the same hours, but making radically different amounts of money because people had different skill sets. And some people were like better at knowing what sells than others. And it ended up being like super fucked up and unfair. I tried to do this like one system where everybody sat down and was just radically transparent about what their financial needs were. And we tried to do like a from each according to their ability to each according to their need thing. And I quickly realized it did not make sense because people who grew up super broke radically underestimated their financial needs, and people who grew up more financially comfortable overestimated their needs. And it became obvious when I'm like staring at somebody like, yeah, I don't really need to eat that much. My food budget can be $75 a month. And they're like,
Mm.
cool, but I need an extra $500 a month just for the Whole Foods salad bar that I enjoy going to every day. And I need to get my nails done. So that obviously didn't work either because people have these like very different ideas of money. And I remember being like, at one point, everybody at the company made around $50,000 a year. And I was like, this is the most money I've ever made in my life. And somebody else who worked at the company came to me privately and was like, it's not really fair that you tell people we make a living wage because nobody can live off $50,000 a year. And I remember being shocked by that and being like, this is more money than like my parents made at that time. This is more money than anybody in my family's ever made. Like, this is the most money I've made. What do you mean this isn't livable? And it's just like this disconnect. So that was an issue. So then the final thing we decided on is just like everybody makes exactly the same pay per day of work that you do. And I tried to set it based on what HUD designated as not being low income in our county. I don't think we've caught up with inflation this year because sales have slowed. So we like voted not to do our inflation raises. But that was literally how we came up with the amount of money we made. And it was just like, okay, everything else is too complicated to calculate. We're all just going to earn the exact same take home pay per day. And if there ever is profit at the end of the year, we just split it up evenly and everybody votes on how this works and what we do with it. And that was just the easiest system. And it ended up being something that worked remarkably well, super, super easy for things like bookkeeping and accounting. And I think everybody at the company like knows it's fair basically. And that is like the best system I possibly came up with. So there's no profit extraction from the owners there. Oh, and also we have an equity agreement. So the company had utilized financing, and financing is actually really, really difficult for worker co-ops to get because they're considered very high risk. So legally, I'm 100% owner, and to mitigate that, we have an equity agreement where the amount of hours you work at the company contributes to your equity. So if the business ever were to sell, for example, I only have 19.86% equity. And it's the most because I've worked there the longest, but like this person who's worked there the second longest has around 14% equity. And it's like that. And the kind of equity pool also affects your voting rights at the company. So, that kind of contributes to not having a super hierarchical system as well. So, for example, if I really wanted to do something in the business that nobody else wanted to do, it would just take the three next people after me all agreeing that what I wanted to do was a really bad idea rather to outrank me at the job and vote to like not go with my plan. So we implemented a lot of systems like that to try to keep things really, really fair. And I think it's worked well, but again, because nobody else who works at the company is a Marxist or a communist, there's a lot of things that I have to teach them. Like there was one year where, for example, we had a lot of profit and I told everybody, here's how much profit we have. What do you guys want to do with it? And everybody famously like voted to buy new cars with it because everyone's cars were messed up. I still have people who work at the company that are like, yeah, and then you bought me a car. And I'm like, I did not buy you a car. That was not my money. That was the company's money that it generated from your labor. Like you bought yourself a car. And they're like, okay, whatever. You bought me a car. And they like don't get it. So it's very, very interesting being in the position where I'm like, okay, I'm a Marxist and I'm in charge. So we're doing Marxist shit. But also, I'm only kind of in charge. You guys know you have like rights and you can do these things. And every time I'm like, how do you guys want to handle this situation? We do these like voting systems, and invariably the voting is like, Madeline just decides. And I'm like, okay, guys, all right, cool, thanks. So it's very, very funny. So if you go on the internet, you'll see people think that I'm like this evil dictator. And then if you go to our workplace, everybody else is like, I don't understand Marxism or care at all. I just like that I get a paycheck and we have time off. And it's cool that I have a car now. But I think that's like been a real lesson in like meeting like other people in the working class where they are. Like they don't have to understand Marxism necessarily to like it, right? And that actually brought me around more on the idea of vanguardism in general. Like, do these people really need to be lectured at for 3 hours so they understand why they have a car now? Or is that just punishment at this point because they don't really care? Right. So that's been an interesting thing to encounter, like running the business. It's just a bunch of like LA party kids who aren't really interested in Marxism. And I have to like manage the ship basically and also kind of teach them about it along the way and trying to teach them their value and what their labor means and how this actually works.
So what you're basically saying is the general population is like the elves from Harry Potter or Dobby, like they want to be exploited or no, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
No, they don't want to be exploited, but they also don't want to be lectured to, and they don't necessarily care.
No.
They're like, it's cool, I can like show up and do my job and be treated well, but I don't really need to read 16 books about it. I just trust you got it handled because you've shown me that you're cool. And I'm like, okay, this is really so to me, it is a lesson in vanguardism. It's like if you show up and show people you're cool and do nice shit for them, they don't necessarily need to read 16 books, but you can teach them a little along the way. But mostly, I found that a lot of people trust you if they see you care about them. And it makes me think a lot about like the Black Panther Party. Like people in their communities weren't Marxists, but they started trusting the Marxists more because the Marxists were the ones driving them to their dialysis or giving their kids food before school or, doing babysitting programs or grocery programs. And I think, like, that's kind of what it showed me. It's like, "Okay, you guys don't have to understand why I'm doing this. You don't care to understand why I'm doing this. That's fine. But you understand that it's happening. You understand you have a car. You understand you have voting rights. You understand you have equity. You understand we all earn the same pay." And that's enough for them to be like, "I don't know, working for a Marxist is pretty cool." So,
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of leftists will fall into this idea that like all 350 million or so Americans need to read like Das Kapital from like cover to cover in order for us to have a revolution. No, I mean, y- w- there's always going to be people who don't have time to read or fully comprehend Marx. We just need to meet them where there are, and most people just want a roof over their heads. They want food on the table. They just want their kids to be educated, and we can totally get them to become Marxists just by proving through action, through leadership, that Marxism can provide them that. And slowly, of course, like, yeah, like you said, teach them things along the way. Um, it's odd. One thing I've always heard is like, socialism, communism, whatever, it's so bureaucratic and inefficient. But the way that companies are typically run, with this like very hierarchical position, uh, I think that leads to the most inefficiency ever because an employee is nothing but a worker drone. If something is going wrong at the company or something is being fucked up, you got to go through the channels of your boss, and your boss doesn't give a fuck, and then you got to go through the manager, and the manager doesn't give a fuck. When everybody owns the company, not only is there nobody like pushing pencils, trying to like make it to the end of the day, but also I do you find it has more efficiency than like our traditional companies?
oh, definitely. Yeah. Like I'm dating somebody right now who's working a very, very traditional 9 to 5 job. And when I hear about how fucked up their work is, how inefficient, how much bureaucracy, they've got consultants who don't know what they're doing. They've got this group of people coming in to do this thing and they're not doing it right. And nobody's in charge and everything's behind and everybody's getting just like paid to do weird bullshit jobs that don't make sense. You listen to it and you're like, whoa. And then by contrast, at our business, everybody treats it like it's their own. Everybody is cross trained on everything. Everybody is always willing to pitch in. I mean, we are like subjected to market whims like everybody else, right? Like we can control what happens in our four walls, I always say, but we can't control like the free market capitalist economic system outside. When we hit slow periods, everybody decides together what to do. And it's easier and more efficient. Like Most recently, we've had like everybody's had a really slow first quarter. I don't know if you've seen it yet. The first quarter numbers haven't come out, but the projections are that everybody is down significantly. And we had to basically vote to like reduce hours and do all these things like how are we going to handle this situation? It was very, very efficient because everybody cares about the business and wants it to succeed and nobody's fighting anything. They're just like, okay, this is what has to happen. Here's what we're doing. Boom, boom, boom. We're all on board. And what you find is like everybody is always going to be on board with whatever makes the most sense for the company because they want the company to survive and prosper and do well because they view the company as an extension of their livelihood. And we have very, very low employee turnover at our business, which means we don't have to waste time training people. We don't have to deal with the inefficiency of new hires replacing people. Everybody kind of knows their job. And like even when periods are slow, sometimes you'll see some people be like, "Oh, well, I have this skill set. It's really easy for me to go do freelance work. I'm going to take 6 months to go do some freelance work, save the company some money, and then I'll bounce back in." And they get to retain their equity for that whole time they're gone. So like it's just this very like naturally occurring model where everybody kind of works together to solve the problem and they care a lot and they're invested and there's not a lot of redundancy and there's not a lot of overstepping. And people also are pretty compassionate with each other too, which is cool. Like people look at each other and be like, okay, you have fewer other options. So the priority is keeping you at full time employment through the slowdown period. So, like, it's very humane and it just kind of works very, very easily. I don't know how to describe it, but it is very efficient. There's not, there's not. I don't know how to explain it. There's not that kind of bureaucracy. We could use a little more bureaucracy, maybe. Sometimes we're too chill with each other, but it is, we run a tight ship. We are scrappy, we're small, and we're flexible, and we can roll with the punches as a result of that, and it does feel a lot more efficient because of that, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. As somebody who's worked in corporate America before, that suffocating world, a lot of the times, in a traditional capitalist structure, and conservatives will always say like, "Oh, communism is so efficient," whatever, whatever. But a lot of times, in the way that capitalism is run, efficiency is actually sacrificed in order to maintain power structures, right? Like
Yeah.
the goal ultimately under capitalism is not to get as efficient as possible within the workplace and to produce as much is to keep the workers in a subservient position where they're constantly exploited and they know their fucking place, right? I think that a lot of the times to capitalists is more important than actually making more profits. It's to remind you that you are under them, to remind you that you have no power and that I have the power, and they will absolutely all the time sacrifice efficiency, sacrifice better profit, sacrifice a better working environment just to remind you that you are not them. Especially with, alienation where like you spend most of your life working for to make somebody else rich, right? You don't even
Right.
own the shit that you're making, right? You make watches, or no, you make burgers for the McDonald's, right? Or I don't even know if the McDonald's are still around. Was the McDonald's a family or was it just two dudes? How did that happen? Oh, you know what? Walmart, the
Walmart,
Waltons,
that's good,
the
yeah,
Waltons, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
You, you,
Sam
you,
Walton.
you stock shelves every single day for the Walton family. You don't stock shelves for yourself. And so the majority of your life is spent making something for somebody else, like making profits for somebody else. And then I'm assuming, of course, in tunnel vision, everybody loves their job. Everybody loves because they're not alienated. They're not doing it for Madeline. They're doing it for themselves.
Right. I mean, the only people who've really had problems in the workplace, there's a specific type of person who does not fit well into our workplace, and it's people who overestimate their worth and underdevelop on their or underdeliver on their work. And these are the people who don't like it because they're like, I'm the shit. I'm the best. I'm spectacular. I'm doing all these amazing things. You guys are also lucky I'm here. And everyone's like, okay, that's cool as long as you deliver on it. And the second those people don't deliver on it, everybody else is like, whoa, 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 what happened to you doing all these things? Like, we're all working our asses off. There's no space here for somebody who talks a big game but doesn't deliver. Like, the people who deal the best in our work environment are people who are humble and work hard. And so sometimes you run into somebody who's the opposite. They're all talk, little action. And those are the people who don't enjoy their job because all of a sudden, all of their coworkers are like, we see you not delivering. You can't hide here. Inefficient people who don't want to work, who want to pat themselves on the back for how awesome they are, cannot hide at our business because your coworkers notice immediately because the culture is so different from that. The culture isn't built around individual exceptionalism. It's not built around talking a big game and not delivering. It's built around what are you doing? How much are you pitching in? Are you helping? Are you actually completing your tasks? Do we have to cover for you? Like, And that's like a really interesting thing. So I think the 3 people who've worked at the company over the past 13 years who have not enjoyed the structure have all had that personality type in common, where they spend more time doing PR about how awesome they are than actually doing their work, and their coworkers notice. So everybody else loves their job, because they put in the work, they get the results, we're working together, they're respected, and that's like a really interesting thing I've had to personally learn when it comes to hiring. I'm like, okay, people with this personality type will not thrive in our workplace because they're accountable sometimes for the first time. Maybe they come from more corporate structures or more individualistic structures where it is more about how exceptional they are. But it's like, there's no promotions here. There's no hierarchy. You don't get a promotion. You don't get a raise. There's no boss to impress. You do your work or you don't. And if you don't do your work, you fuck over all of your coworkers. You compromise the livelihood of everybody here. Like we had somebody we hired as a designer who fell short of their goal 2 years in a row by over $1 million. And it severely financially impacted the company. And you can't hide from that, In our business, it's like your coworkers see the numbers and now they're mad at you because you fucked over everybody. And I think like that's a really hard thing for some people to wrap their heads around if they're not used to doing the work. If they think of themselves as too special to get their hands dirty, like there's no room for that at our business. But for people who do like doing the work, do like getting their hands dirty, and don't think of themselves as being super, super special and unique. Just like, I'm an average person. I'm just here to do a job and get a paycheck, and I'm going to do my job the best I can. Those are the people who love it there. And that's why we have such low turnover. And the people who leave are the people who really weren't there to be a worker. They were there to because it sounds like a cool job, and they wanted to be able to tell people they had a cool job. And I don't know, it's like a very, very interesting thing we all kind of learn together about the types of people who thrive in these environments and the types of people who don't. And I think like capitalism does provide an opportunity for people who talk a big game but don't do much to skate by. I think I've worked in corporate places too. And I think we've all encountered people like that, maybe in the managerial class or people who I always think of salespeople as being this way. There's always like salespeople who bring home these big salaries but aren't actually contributing anything to the overall health of the company. They're all talk and they're little action. And I think like that's one of the inefficiencies of the corporate structure is that there's so much hand holding for like the boys club mentality of if you show up and tell everybody how awesome you are, or and if you look busy for the 12 minutes when the boss is there, you can just get promoted indefinitely no matter how bad you are at your job, right? And I think that's the stuff that leads to these weird bureaucratic inefficiencies where you have random dudes with too much power at a company who don't actually know what they're doing and don't do anything themselves, and they're collecting paychecks to basically be ineffective. And we look at like the bloated CEO salaries, for example, and we see that same thing. Lots of companies we're finding now when they don't have a CEO, their sales stay relatively the same because that guy's not actually doing anything at the end of the day and he's taking home these huge paychecks. So I think like that is one of the uniquely inefficient things about capitalism and about these systems that are more based on optics and relationships than about results or about the actual work. I mean, one of the things too about inefficiencies of capitalism, or like what you were talking about, where it's more about the control and the subjugation, is when we went down to a 28-hour work week. I can't remember the figures. I wrote them in the book, but our revenue either increased by 300 or 600%.
Mm.
And it was massive. And it had to do a lot with people not feeling exhausted all the time. When they came into work, there wasn't a lot of downtime. People were really efficient when they were there because they're like, at this point, a full time work week at our business is 28 hours a week. So you're like, yeah, my 28 hours a week that I'm at work, I'm fucking crushing it because I'm only there 28 hours a week. And like that led to us being a lot more efficient as well. So, we have a 4-day work week. And when people talk about a 4-day work week, everywhere we've seen 4-day work weeks be implemented. We've seen efficiency go up. And that's really when you get to the point where you're like, capitalism is such a contradiction. It's not even results oriented for what it's trying to accomplish. Right. And that doesn't even get into the whole idea of overproducing goods you don't even need for society to function just to drive that profit incentive. And we have to deal with that too, just because it's free market capitalism. We have to sell shit even when people don't need it. And that's an inefficiency of capitalism that we can't control. So you think about like communist socialism, Marxism, and you think about how much more efficient it would be to just plan things and produce what you need, and how fewer hours people probably would need to work in order to accomplish that. And you just really start to see how silly and ridiculous our whole system is right now. It's just all backwards and weird and wrong, and it rewards incorrect behavior.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the oddest things about, capitalism is that, it currently every single study, like you said, has shown that the 4-day work week actually improves efficiency. But right now, every single capitalist is trying to squeeze even more work out of us than possible. The Google CEO came out recently and said he wanted to switch to like an 80-hour work week or something ridiculous like that. And the reason that they're doing it isn't because they actually, at the end of the day, want efficiency. It's because they're afraid of the working class. They want the working class to be tired, exploited, subservient, and they will sacrifice their efficiency if they can get that. I mean, corporate culture, right? Marx and Engels, they found that class society arose from like man first discovering agriculture and getting these surpluses and then like slavery. But a culture is the ultimate manifestation of class society, where you're sort of just stuck in this like perpetual, I hate to say it, like it sounds a little bit fucked up, sexist, whatever. But like ball licking of your boss, like in order to get like raises, like you're constantly like, "Oh, boss, I love you. I'm doing so great." Like your boss walks by and you're like super busy on your computer. You're competing with your employees to see who loves their boss the most. I mean, it's the oddest manifestation of class society in order to become as subservient of a machine to this human being who's above you as possible. And these human beings will sacrifice your life in order to just keep you into that position. They love that position. It's a dominant, subservient relationship that they do on purpose. Um, and of course, there's no sense to capitalism. If tomorrow Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and I don't know who else, Mark Zuckerberg went into a coma, their companies would run just fine. Their companies would continue to run. We do not need, it's such a contradiction where we have one of the most highly skilled working classes in history. We do not need a boss. We genuinely do not need bosses. Workers can run these companies and do their services just fine. That's the big contradiction. We do not need to give a surplus value to these losers in Silicon Valley or these losers on top, especially Elon Musk. I mean, good God, everything about him is just, but yeah, I think it's just capitalism loves egomaniacs, like those people you were describing who overemphasize their worth but underdeliver on their value. And this ego, my cousin's husband has like come home and he's like a MAGA guy, he's like a Trump guy, and he's come home and he's been like, my boss pulled me aside at our company and he yelled at me for like 3 hours, like something like that. And it's just he can't understand it, and it's been a really good jumping off point for like conversations to get the ball moving for him a little bit. But capitalism just loves to make you subservient in order to just keep that class hierarchy there. Madeline, if you want to add on to it, otherwise we can move on.
No, no, I just think that's a really good point where it's like, yeah, one of the inefficiencies is you spend all this time trying to impress this random person who maybe they're not even good at what they do. And I think about how many jobs I had when I was first starting out in the workforce at like age 14, where you'd enter a workplace and you'd be like, hey, there's a more efficient way we could be doing this. And your boss is like, well, I don't like it because you came up with it. So no. And then you're like, okay, cool. So now we're not allowed to do this super efficient thing that I think would be a good idea because of interpersonal dynamics being weird and this just idea that like the worker must be subservient to their boss and it doesn't matter how efficient or inefficient anything about that arrangement is. And that's like an interesting thing as well. And I think like at our workplace, one of the things that's really interesting too is you don't like have to impress me and you don't have to like me and like I don't know, it's like a very, very interesting dynamic. There's a few people at the company who are my friends who got hired on, but one of the more interesting things I think everybody who's been there many, many years has seen is that the people who were the ones who were like, I'm so special, I'm the best at everything, and then show up and don't do any work. And then when everybody's like, hey, we kind of noticed you're not doing work, they're like, I'm oppressed. I've been a victim. How dare you ask me to do anything? Those are the people who started out as my friends. So in our workplace, you see actually like, oh, being friends with Madeline doesn't actually get you anywhere. It gets you more scrutiny at this job because we're all skeptical now because we've seen the people who show up and think because they have a good relationship with me, they can skate by doing hardly any work. And it's like, oh, no, 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 no. Because you have a good relationship with me, now you're under more scrutiny. It's like the opposite of a traditional workplace in that way because we don't have room for dead weight here. Like the relationship matters less than anything else at this company. So I think that really is interesting coming from different work environments where, like you said, it's like having a good relationship with your boss is sometimes all you need to get promoted. And how when you remove that, all of a sudden it's like your whole relationship to work changes.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's just capitalism sucks. Like, what can you say? Pretty much.
Yeah.
Um, do you see any utility in your in Tunnel Vision's business strategy, the way it's organized in furthering revolutionary struggle, or do you just sort of see it as a way to survive under capitalism for now? Like, is there any possibility this could be used in some kind of struggle against capitalism, or is it just temporary?
I kind of view it I kind of position it intellectually the same way I position the arguments about like labor unions versus vanguardism. I think that I used to be like a syndicalist. I used to, even when I made the transition into communism, it was like, okay, make, I think like there's a position for like labor unions to like guide us. And I have my own podcast and my podcast co-host, he and I have known each other since we were like sophomores in high school. And he's more of like a labor union guy, but I think that my experience in our workplace has shown me the limitations of that approach. The idea that just like workplace structures will somehow lead the revolution. I don't think that's true. I don't think actually there is a way in which just having a radically structured workplace is enough to fight capitalism. I think it needs to be like a governmental organizational shift that can't just happen from like, I don't know, more worker co-ops or something like that, which doesn't mean worker co-ops are bad or are structured that's not legally a worker co-op but operates off of that kind of model. I don't think that that's bad, but I do think ultimately at the end of the day, it's just a band-aid on capitalism because like we do still have to compete with the free market, right? We do still have to sell things even when people don't need things so we can get paychecks and pay our rent, pay our bills. We do have to ride the waves of like good sales years and bad sales years and like be subjected to all of these issues that affect how we do business. And it's not enough. It's not enough. Even if every single company in the United States operated the way ours did, we would still have to contend with those free market, kind of laissez faire economic policies of the governing body. And like, it wouldn't be enough. It would be a better quality of life for a lot of people, but it wouldn't be guaranteed employment, right? Because at a certain point, if your company doesn't have money, how can you guarantee employment? It's just not there. It also wouldn't deal with the issues of overproduction, which is a major thing that I'm aware of, that I'm super conscious of because of my job. Like, there's so much overproduction and waste that goes into capitalist production just because you have to sell stuff even when people are done needing stuff. All of these things wouldn't be addressed just by restructuring workplaces. I think it's a great start. I think it's great that we can do it under capitalism, but I don't think it's a substitution for revolutionary action. And like I said, I think that if anything, having the business has made me lean more into like the Leninist idea of vanguardism really being what we need and the way.
Absolutely. I mean, I think even if you have a worker co-op, even if you had like 100, 200, 300, like even if half of all the companies in America or the world became worker co-ops, they would still be beholden to market forces, market drives. It's very different from a worker co-op in socialism where, it's centrally planned and, there's no competition and, especially when, even if you have a worker co-op, there's always a capitalist who is exploiting the shit out of, employees, always exploiting the shit out of, minimum wage or even underwaged workers in sweatshops. And they'll always be able to undercut these co-ops. Like conservatives so often say, like, why don't you just start your own socialist company? And it's like, our communist goal isn't to like, well, most communist goal isn't to just like live in this commune in the middle of the forest, isolated from society. It's to radically change society itself. It's not to just change society for yourself and a handful of friends, and that can't be done without, like you said, vanguardism, revolution. Which is why I always find these co-op arguments from. I love him, of course, Richard Wolff, and I'm hoping to have him on the show eventually. But I always find his co-op arguments a little bit misguided in terms of how co-ops operate within a market. Um, your tunnel vision is very goth. It's very, and you yourself have been in the goth, alt, punk scenes. What do you think these scenes and tend towards anarchism rather than like state socialism or Marxism? Why is that such a predominant? Well, there are like examples of Rage Against the Machine. They're Marxist-ish, but others are very anarchist. Why is that a general trend, you think?
Okay, so I have a lot of feelings about this, and I actually think like the subculture relationship to politics. I think one, it varies depending on what subculture you're in, and it changes over time.
Mm.
So I think that goth culture, for example, to me has always been pretty apolitical. My mom was pretty goth in the '80s. She's a libertarian. I think that my dad was into punk rock. He was an anarchist. And I think a lot about what appeals to people about subculture aesthetics is this idea of doing things that are different, right? And I think what goes along with being different is this idea of like, don't tell me what to do. Nobody tells me what to do. And I think that's why it lends itself to this individualistic approach to politics. There was like this one time when I was a teenager and I was really into hardcore, and there was a kind of goth website. It was goth or not. I don't know if you guys remember it. And it would just be pictures of goths and you would rate if you thought they looked goth or not. And that was the whole website. It was like early days of the internet. And we all thought it would be funny to go in MS Paint and take pictures of ourselves and draw like fake goth makeup on ourselves to like make fun of the goths and post it on goth or not. But the kind of like verbiage, like we'd put text on these images, would be very like individualistic and pouty and whiny. So like mine, for example, was like, "Oh, my parents make me clean my room. I want to die, goth or not," and it is this very individualistic, don't tell me what to do thing throughout subculture that I think even intuitively we knew and we were kind of making fun of. And it exists in the anarchy kind of punk rock scene. It exists in that weird libertarian goth scene, and that's why so many goths in particular, or even old school punk rockers, end up becoming libertarians, becoming Republican lights or Republican mega, depending on how you view it. And it's just this individualistic approach of not wanting to be controlled. And I think that's like very, very fascinating because so much about punk rock is also community based. So you would think that it would be more community driven, but I think the reconciliation a lot of people come to is that like you choose to give to your community, and I think it's fascinating because it takes being a part of that community and seeing that that system doesn't always work, right? To lead you to want something more structured, something more organized. I was an anarchist for years. I consider myself a social anarchist. I did all the reading about what they called libertarian socialism, and I understand that there's these structures that a lot of anarchists want to have in place still. It doesn't mean no organization. But ultimately, the thing that I realized about existing in those types of communities is like my values have to matter even for people I hate. Like if I fucking hate you, I still think you should have the right to food, to shelter, to healthcare, to an education, to a job. And these ideas that you exist in a community and people just take care of each other, it it really falls apart when you're in these subculture spaces and you see how people treat someone they don't like, or you see how people treat someone who fucked up once, or you see how people treat someone who maybe fucked up a few times and continues to fuck up more and more and more because they're ostracized from their community rather than given resources and support to do better. And that's when, to me, I saw the limitations of anarchism is seeing that it was this hyper individualistic and punitive and carceral system, which is the complete opposite, ironically, of what people want to position anarchism is. And I'll get in fights with anarchists about this to this day, right? They'll be like, well, that's not how it's supposed to work. And I'm like, okay, but that's how I've seen it work. And regulation saves lives, rules save lives. And I don't think you should have to be well liked by your neighbors to have access to the things you need to live.
Mm.
And that has been one of the biggest things about me growing up is looking at somebody being like, I fucking hate you. Like, I do not like you, but I will fight for your right to have these basic fundamental things you need to live a good life. And I think that's like one of the things people on the internet can't understand about me is that I'm not a nice person. Like, I'm kind of an asshole and I'm kind of rude to people. But despite that, I believe there are fundamental baseline things all people should be entitled to in a society to live a good life. And that is what confuses people, and especially confuses people with that individualistic kind of anarchist mindset, because they almost operate the opposite way. They're like, I like you. I'm so nice to absolutely everybody. But if you piss me off, then all of a sudden, who cares about what you need to live a good life? Like, I don't have to worry about your right to shelter, or your right to healthcare, or your right to any of these things. And so I think that that's like the difference between actually being community minded versus individualistic. Like, actually being community minded means remembering that the people you hate are part of your community. And what do you do when the most unlikable fucking person on the planet is standing in front of you testing your values? Like, where do you come out after that? And that also, I think, plays into like why so many anarchists have a hard time wrapping their head around what I call ACAB politics, right? You'll see people be like, "ACAB, like, fuck the cops," but also, arrest all these people, like, arrest anybody who, like, steps on you or gets in your way, and, like, in particular, like, arrest your rapist or whatever, or arrest all pedos, or put them in jail and throw away the key. And it's this very punitive carceral thing that's in direct opposition to the ACAB quote unquote politics that they profess to have. And it's because it hasn't been examined, but also because it's hyper reactive and individualistic. So I just think that like subculture kind of breeds that individualism, in part because the aesthetics appeal to people who don't like being told what to do. And part of telling people what to do in like a system of Marxism or communism or whatever is to one, deconstruct your ideas, question them, question each other, self critique, critique of others, right? To think community oriented, to accept certain things as given rights all people have, and to like this idea of education, this idea of growth, this idea of change, this idea that people are the result of systems that shape them and guide them. And that when you change the systems, you have the opportunity to affect the outcome in terms of how people act and treat each other. And that's kind of the opposite of like that anarchist libertarian mindset. Like, I eventually came around on this idea that anarchism is a right wing ideology. It is the furthest extension of a right wing ideology because it presupposes that people are directly responsible for themselves, that systems don't shape and guide us, and that systems can't help us or save us. It's a very like everyone for themselves kind of mentality, no matter how much you try to dress it up in like community and social ideas or social organization, because that's not how it ends up in practice. So I don't know. It's been a very, very interesting thing for me to kind of witness and be a part of. And I think that now we're dealing with the apparent liberalized, like liberal kind of identity of those subculture spaces is really coming out right now. Like you see it. You see people who are so individualistic that they're like, well, I want to protect my rights as a marginalized person, and I am willing to sacrifice brown people in other countries who are being murdered by the US war machine in order to do that. That's why I vote blue no matter who. And like, it's just this very, very fascinating kind of thing coming out. So yeah, I think that like the counterculture element of subculture is kind of a myth politically in a lot of ways. And what we see is that counterculture, subculture spaces are actually reinforcing very individualistic right wing ideas in support of capitalist models, which has taken me decades to kind of realize.
Yeah, no, I think your answer is spot on because, I might say something controversial right now, but like all alt cultures in America and like anarchism are based off of liberalism, like the ultimate extension of liberalism, and you can't really escape it. I mean, American liberalism, especially, was founded on this deep, deep distrust of government and the state and organized society and for the free market as much as possible. And, to some extent, it was, liberalism was a progressive idea at that time when you lived in the era of absolute kings, right? Like when God appointed kings had ultimate power, distrust of the government and organized structures was somewhat commendable. But ultimately, like Marxists like Lenin and Stalin, they analyze anarchism as an extension of liberalism in that it even distrusts hierarchy and the state, and it sort of attributes a moral character to the state. Whereas Marxists see hierarchy and the state as something neutral. It's just something that came out of the antagonisms of class division, class rule. There were these people at the top at the beginnings of early human civilization, and these people at the bottom. The people at the top were a minority, so they needed a state in order to remain in power. And the only way for us to get rid of classes in the state is to wield that power in order to suppress the enemies of the working class. And whether you like it or not, you're going to accidentally end up creating a state regardless, right? You're going to accidentally end up creating a police force as long as there are people as long as there are workers who are reactionary and believe in bourgeois ideas, as long as there are the bourgeois, as long as there is capitalism, as long as there are enemies of socialism, you're going to have some kind of policing force, right? Like you're going to have some kind of military force. You're going to have some kind of, and these are all tools of class rule that have no moral character to them. They just simply exist for use. But I think anarchists, where they get into this ultimate liberal idealism, is that they believe that hierarchy itself is bad, that the state itself is bad, and that it has this moral characteristic that needs to be gotten rid of immediately. And it rejects historical materialism. It rejects how societies have evolved, how we've transitioned from one system to another, and it supplants that for, I'm sorry to say, but idealism. And I've met anarchists. They're very nice people. All the anarchists I've met have been very nice people, but they are products of the culture that we're raised in America, which is this ultimate individualism, which is this ultimate fuck the government, distrust of everything. And that is also a lot of our alt cultures, a lot of our punk cultures, they're all based in this sort of like even distrust of the distrust, right? So like American distrust of hierarchies and, the government. Of course, there was always a government and hierarchies, but American distrust of like the government in terms of limiting laissez-faire economic systems, markets, that became mainstream in the conservative places. And so really the punk culture, in my opinion, was an extension of rejecting the traditional individualism for a new kind of individualism, but it didn't escape it. It didn't escape it. It just reinvented the wheel for its own sort of subculture. Um, eh, Things like that. Do you agree? Do you disagree, Madeline?
I agree completely. I think that's totally what it is. And I think like the I understand the intentions and goals of like having this idea of freedom, but I think like the chief contradiction in liberalism has always been where your freedom ends and someone else's freedom begins, right? And what you need to be a truly free person in society, what does that mean? And that means social support. And social support shouldn't be something that can be granted on a whim or taken away based on whether your community decides you're a bad actor or not. Like if you really believe in these things, they need to be granted and guaranteed for absolutely everybody. And you can't exist in a situation where like your freedom to do whatever the fuck you want impedes on other people's freedom to be able to live their lives. And I understand that like anarchist organization, like when it's theorized or, in practice, is supposed to come with all of these checks and balances to ensure these things don't happen and that things are super community minded. But in reality, it is just that extension of a hyper individualistic, almost immature, childish, don't tell me what to do. I don't like that kind of mentality. And that is not actually how society functions. And I think like the ACAB thing is a great example of it because like I consider myself a prison abolitionist in the United States as prison currently exists here as a tool of mass incarceration, prison industrial complex, enslavement of marginalized people in order to maintain like this exploited labor class for our corporations doing prison labor. The privatized prison system itself being a massive incentive for profit for the owning class. All of these systems, to me, I view prison in a capitalist system as being a byproduct of those things. It's like the ultimate labor issue, prison, right?
Yeah.
So in the United States, in the government we have, I consider myself, yes, a prison abolitionist. But when you look at, for example, a thing I think about a lot is Xinjiang in China. And you look at not the CIA propaganda, which is the other chief complaint I have of being an anarchist. You're so eager to dismiss the validity of state action that you end up just doing the State Department's work for free and repeating all these bullshit fake talking points the CIA came up with about other countries that aren't even real. But your pride won't let you admit that, right? Your pride won't let you admit a country did something good maybe once. But when you look at like Xinjiang, for example, this is like a great example. Xinjiang in China was dealing with religious extremism. They were dealing with people trying to kind of incite kind of a separatist view of Muslim people in Xinjiang and be like, rebel, like, fight against the government there. And the solution that China came up with was to literally do job training and re-education. And we joke as communists about re-education camps, but you look at it and you're like, this is a really humane and amazing system. Like they did something great with this. Here in the United States, we went to war and murdered millions of people. and displaced millions more. And that's how we dealt with quote unquote religious extremism, right? And we don't even deal with Christian religious extremism here, really. And there they were like, oh, okay, so there's an opportunity where people are being radicalized into something that is negative and destructive. Why? And then they found that that was a community that was in need of increased economic resources, increased job training, that it was kind of starting to become a disaffected community because Xinjiang hadn't really been considered as closely as it could have been from this like job training perspective. And they did all these really amazing things there that were actually alternatives to just waiting until people commit crimes and then imprisoning them. And you look at that and you're like, is this not like the ultimate extension of what should be, the ACAB mentality? Like, provide enough social services and support in society where people don't feel disaffected enough that they need to do things that your society has decided are crimes, because that's a whole thing too. It's like what we even decide is criminal activity is a choice in our society. So you look at that and you're like, this was a structure, this was bureaucracy, this was a system that provided these resources and support that actually made it so that fewer people would be engaging in what they considered harmful criminal activity in that region. Fewer people would need to go to prisons. And that was provided by a system. So I think like that's a really interesting component of like quote unquote ACAB politics. Like, yeah, I consider myself a prison abolitionist in the United States government's current capitalist system, the way prisons manifest here. But if we had a different system, we would have, like you said, there's always going to people who are engaging in counter-revolutionary activities. There's always going to be people who want to reinstate some sort of bourgeois political system that exploits others. And you do need a security force armed against that to protect people. And there are ways also of performing that type of security in a way that protects vulnerable people from being exploited by those outside kind of instigators who want counter-revolutionary action. And I think like Xinjiang's actually an awesome example of how they handled that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the oddest things about anarchists is that they're always on the side of the protester against those in power, no matter what the relations of those in power are, right? Like they'll always bring up the Kronstadt rebellion. But like if you look at the Kronstadt rebellion and the Russian Civil War, these were workers who in the middle of a civil war in which the Bolsheviks are barely trying to survive and everybody's barely getting any food, they started an anti-government protest. Like if they had not repressed that, there would have been no revolution. But it's always the question of like when you're about to get into power and somebody's out in the street marching against you, you will always pick the person out in the streets marching against that power. That's the ultimate problem with American anarchism, is there's such a distrust of actually wielding power that you're always listening to people in the streets. This fetishization of being in the streets and anti-government and anti-state, to the point where you don't even look at the structures of the state. You don't even look at what the people are demanding. You don't even look at what they're demanding wins, what that will entail. It's this ultimate, like you've been saying this whole time, this ultimate individualism, unable to contextualize how your individualism sometimes is selfish to other people, sometimes does trample on the rights. When we look at everything through the frame of the individual, tramples on the rights of millions of other people. If the Kronstadt workers had won, the white armies would have taken over Russia, and Russia would have been this like fascist shithole. It's just this inability, and that's really what has gotten a lot of anarchist projects in the past, like the CNT, fell into very ugly infighting because they were unable to have a singular ideological line. It's this inability to recognize that even factions sometimes are bad. You have to have a singular ideological line, or you become weak, you become fractured. People can exploit that, but anarchists are unable to recognize this because everything to them is based on the individual and not the community. And that really reflects its liberal origins, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I recently did this like poll on my Twitter where I was just like, "Oh, I want to see how many people used to be anarchists and then just became like full-blown commies versus the opposite." And the trend overwhelmingly is that people who start out as anarchists, the more they learn, they become communists, and it doesn't really happen in the reverse. And I think that's because so much about anarchism does involve unlearning that unconditional support for whatever you consider to be a revolution or a protest or people in the street. And it's like, for me, the things that I started to be like, oh shit, I don't like this, is because I accidentally ended up supporting oh, student protests, those are good, right? And then you look deeper and you're like, I'm literally supporting a CIA-backed coup. Like, this
Mhm.
isn't a student protest. Just because they're fighting the power doesn't mean they're in the right. And that's when you look at, like, Hong Kong, for example, that recent quote unquote student rebellion where CIA backed, you know, protesters, I guess you wanna call them that, broke into parliament and rehung up a British flag. And you're like, as an anarchist, my instinct would be, "Yeah, fight the power." And you're like, "Well, whoa, no, 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 no. They're hanging up a British flag. They're actually this is supposed to be a fake protest in favor of being recolonized? Like, what? How does that make sense?" And so I think you're totally right. It is a fetishization of the aesthetic of rebellion that will lead you to make irrational decisions to support anybody, quote unquote, fighting the power, even if what they're fighting in support of is a worse power, you know?
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think
and a
that's
lot
part.
yeah, yeah, and a lot of anarchist experiments that have succeeded have just accidentally reinvented the state. I think really it's a hard thing to understand, but Marxist-Leninism is inevitable. If you are going to succeed, you're gonna accidentally reinvent Marxist-Leninism. I mean, it's the most or Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, or Hojaism, or whatever, all these tendencies, just Marxism, because it is the most succinct, historical and materialist analysis of how human society got here and how we're gonna progress forward. Because the thing that Marx and Engels did when they envisioned the dictatorship of the proletariat, they didn't start out like saying like, "Oh, we're just gonna have a dictatorship of the proletariat and that's gonna be great." And they started out with, "Okay, how did humans go from hunter gatherers to slave society? How did we go from slave society to feudalism? How do we go from feudalism to capitalism?" They analyzed how society progressed to get us to this point now, and then from that they made predictions about how we get to socialism, communism, and it's not just like they felt like being bad guys, right? Like I think that's unfortunately what a lot of new communists, new anarchists fall into. Like they're just Marx and Engels or Lenin or Stalin or whoever, Mao, Hoja, wanted to just be assholes. Like no, they didn't just want to be assholes. It was a materialist analysis of how humanity got here and how we can get forward. And Marx and Engels were very adamant. The past generations weigh on us. We have to deal with the circumstances that we inherited from all these past generations. That they're just thousands of years of class society of the state that we're going to have to deal with when a revolution comes. We can't just hit the turn off the state button or turn off the commodity production button or turn off the as much as people may want to. We have to deal with all of this baggage and then deconstruct it. It's especially with socialism. Socialism is such a planned thing compared to like capitalism, which could sort of just evolve a little bit whimsically out of feudalism. If that makes sense.
It does make sense. I actually like the use of the term whimsical to describe capitalism because you're subjected to the whims of the market.
Yeah.
And I think about that a lot with my job. And like when I get so frustrated with my work, it does have a lot to do with the inefficiencies of capitalism, and I, like, yearn for that, like, planned economy, like, I really yearn for it, you know? Like, I feel it because of the job I have and because I care about, like, things like overproduction or, things like that. So I think that is, like, a really good point to bring up about just, like, how you inevitably end up recreating these structures because these are the structures that ultimately need to exist.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the thing is, when capitalist revolutionaries were doing the revolutions, they didn't really have a long-term plan. They didn't really know what their societies were evolving into. Socialist, communist, our ultimate plan is to get rid of class society, is to get rid of the state. And so that I think those are the two big differences. Like capitalism was just consider all their worries was the next quarter, basically, or like how do I get my business saved from the mercantilized system of Britain. Um, you on your podcast very often talk about liberal narratives. You deconstruct them. You have great videos on like U.S. aid, or not videos, but podcast episodes on U.S. aid and things like that. Why do you think the liberal and state narratives are so hard to shake for the American left?
God, I think that one of the things that the United States propaganda machine has done very well is try to push the idea of horseshoe theory, and I think that that's why this is the same issue with why anarchism seems so prevalent in the United States as an extension of liberalism. The United States government, by pushing the idea that left-wing governments or left-wing, countries are somehow actually doing secret evil in the world, what they've presented is this idea that there is no alternative to liberalism. That once you create a system that rejects liberalism, you ultimately end up doing evils all around you constantly. And these people are dictators that kill millions of people. And I think that is why, like, Americans in particular have so much faith and trust in our liberal institutions, because we view them as like the alternative to right wing politics instead of being a part of right wing politics, because our government has done such a good job of making us think a true left wing political structure just does not exist or is a pipe dream. And that's why also like the thing about propaganda is so important to me, having Americans really understand that so much of what we think is propaganda, and like our whole views of other countries and how we shape our views of the world is completely invented by this system that wants you to think there is no alternative. So if you move through life and you look, for example, at North Korea, right, the DPRK, and you're like, they're evil. They're evil, evil, evil people. They are doing bad things. They are murdering all of their people. They are making them all get the same haircuts. Nobody's allowed to have pets. It's an evil, evil, backwards place. And you look at that and you're like, well, then that means that communism is not an option. And that means that communism is evil. Communism must be right wing because I think right wing things are evil. What's the other alternative you see presented in front of you? It's liberalism. That's the only alternative left on the table. So that pushes you into this position where you must defend liberalism at all costs because you associate it with being a morally good person. And I think that's something really effective that the United States has done. So when the United States says that communism is not an option, victims of communism, for example, millions of people killed by communism, it pushes people who want to be morally good into this position where they now have to support every liberal political agenda. And that's how you have, the same people who are saying ACAB, who are going to punk shows wearing fucking studded jackets, are now defending USAID, or like a system of the American government that's responsible for like neo-colonization efforts around the globe and literally murders people. Or, that's why these things I think are so important. Like you have people falling for National Endowment for Democracy propaganda, state funded, CIA funded, and congressionally funded propaganda about what China's doing in Xinjiang. They're believing this right wing conspiracy theory kook, Adrian Zenz, who just makes up random bullshit that's verifiably false, about what's happening to the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. And it pushes you in a position where you have to support these institutions because the only other options are evil, right? It's full blown Nazism on one end. And then on the other end, it's the evil, evil dictators of communism who murder millions of people. So what other viable route is there except for to be like a liberal as we think of them on the American political spectrum? Obviously, conservatives are liberals too. It's all a classical or neoliberalist capitalist policy. Your options are literally to be that or an anarchist. So those are the only fields that are presented as being morally beyond reproach, right? And that's the whole thing about how you end up with these people who think they're so progressive and they end up just supporting these violent imperialist tools of the state. And there's nothing actually progressive about that. There's nothing progressive about supporting USA. There's nothing progressive about believing Ned propaganda. There's nothing progressive about repeating CIA talking points that the CIA themselves had released documents now, declassified documents saying, actually, we made this shit up. Like, none of that is actually progressive. But if you want to be a respectable member of society, that's the only acceptable route that has been laid out by how like mainstream conversations about political structures and frameworks exist. Like you don't have another option. So I think that's why liberalism is so appealing to people because they've been told it's the only morally righteous and good option. And I think it's really interesting because for a while there, like the first half of 2024, I was doing a lot of work like on my TikTok trying to deconstruct this ideology in people. And I really was making headway. And I remember it got to the point where there were multiple people making videos like, oh my God, when Madeline Pendleton on TikTok, right? When Madeline Pendleton told me that North Korea is actually a victim of American imperialism and everything we think about it is wrong, my mind was fucking blown. I think people were primed for that because they had just come to understand everything they thought about Israel and Palestine was a lie. And so there was this moment where I was like, "Oh my god, it's happening." Like people are realizing that liberalism is a myth, it's a lie, it's not a path to liberation, it's a tool of oppression, and there is this alternative. And then it's like something like a switch flipped, and all of a sudden there was a huge backlash against that. And everybody was like, no, that's actually evil. These are bad, bad dictators. Remember, everybody, fall back into your like, American government backed talking points. Remember, guys, that's actually an evil way to think. And anybody who tells you that is an evil, evil tanky who wants to kill you. So it's like, you can't, we got so close. And then it's like the propaganda machine just pushed back in a major way. And it sounds conspiratorial, but I think that kind of stuff is intentional. We know that our government is controlling the messaging. And I think the messaging this is why I've been using the term reluctant Democrat a lot lately in all of my media. The government wants you to think the only way to have a left-wing political ideology is to be a reluctant Democrat because it doesn't actually threaten the power structure. And you get to pat yourself on the back by being like, well, I can still condemn the Democratic Party when they do overtly evil things around the globe, by being like, no, that was bad. But ultimately, everything I do materially still supports them and supports this ideology. And I think that's like the great myth of liberalism, right? That it is going to grant everybody freedom in the end, but it's an inherently contradictory ideology because you can't have people free to conduct business in a capitalist system that exploits people and have those workers still free to not be exploited. It's the inherent contradiction of liberalism that people don't want to confront. So I don't know how we push back on that. I think that's the messaging. We have to make it morally unacceptable to capitulate to liberalism. And it's a huge ask, right? It's a huge ask. And that's like something I've started trying to do. I'm trying to unapologetically refuse to capitulate to liberalism and really double down on how liberalism is an evil right wing ideology, and it's an uphill battle, but I think it's one we have to do because I think that's everything we've been talking about like why people who think they're so counterculture, people who engage in subculture, end up falling into these hyper individualistic and not community oriented and not group oriented political models. I think it all has to do with that because they wanna be good people. Everybody wants to be a good person, and the messaging has just convinced them John Oliver's politics are the only way to do it, right?
Yeah, no. I think I agree with everything that you said. There's this great article called "The Iranian Revolution Turns 40: Dare to Know How, Have Courage to Act" by Behruz Tabrizi, and he's an American historian, and he basically highlighted how American leftism came to this position today, where like over decades, well, Western leftism, he's mostly focused in Europe, where like we were told systematically during the state socialists such as the USSR or China that if you have a revolution, a communist revolution, you're going to end up worse than capitalism. So, like so many people over decades, the Euro communists, the left, we were all convinced that if we succeed in a revolution, especially within the Marxist Leninist frameworks, we are going to end up in a society that is more oppressive than capitalism, that is worse than capitalism. So don't you even dare try to rebel. Or if you're going to rebel, rebel in acceptable ways like anarchism or, like
Right.
these non-state. And I think that is an article that everybody should absolutely read. I'll link it in the description below. I'll send it to you too, Madeline. Um,
Yeah,
it's just our goal is to just show people no, actually, the USSR, it had faults. It did many wrongs, like many disgusting wrongs that I condemn. Everybody should condemn. Deportations of minorities. The Great Purges. Things like. That. But the USSR was great. It was better than capitalism. People lived amazing lives in the USSR. People lived amazing lives in the DPRK. These societies are not perfect. They're shaped by the material circumstances. But this idea that they're worse than capitalism, no, 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 friend. They are 100 times better in every way than capitalism. When you are a communist, even if you try your best, even if you try to fuck up the best, you cannot fuck up as much as capitalism has, right? Like that's the thing that's so hard for people to understand. Even when the USSR and China were facing famines, their mortality rates were less than when they were under feudalism, right? Or like a pseudo capitalist feudalism. Even when they fucked up, even when like millions of people died in like famines that were unintentional due to bad policy errors, they still doubled their life expectancies, right? Like you cannot fuck up more than capitalism has done. And you should dare to dream. You should dare to take power. You should dare to be dare I say, a little bit oppressive towards the bourgeois and reactionaries and, what have you. And you get out of this, you have to get out of this mindset that if we succeed, we will accidentally create a dictatorship worse than capitalism. No, 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 you cannot do that. You can only create a system better than capitalism in every single way. Um,
And historically, we see that's true. That's why I always tell people when they're like, "Well, communism doesn't work." I'm like, "What's your metric for working?" Because everywhere that socialism has been implemented, literacy rates and life expectancy have gone up. And that's just a fact. Like there is nowhere where they had a revolution or like places like the DPRK where it's a little unique. They didn't have a revolution. They were freed from Japanese imperial control. They already had these people's committees in place, kind of like a bloodless revolution overnight, if you want to call it that. Every single place, though, that this has happened, the conditions have materially improved. And this idea that capitalism is allowed to be flawed and fucked up and harm people. And, in the United States, it kills nearly a million people a year due to poverty and systemic inequality related issues. That's fine. But communism has to be perfect or you throw it all away. And it's a very, very weird ideology we've fallen into because all data and metrics show that communism, even at its most flawed, even as people are fumbling through it, even as people are trying to figure it out, it does improve the quality of life for literally every single society that has implemented it. And like there's that like quote, that like idealism leads to cynicism, right?
mhm.
And I think that's like what I like about Marxism is people think it's a pipe dream, and you're like, this is actually so far removed from the idea of an idealistic pipe dream. This is very achievable, and this is very realistic, and it's very practical. And it doesn't have to be perfect to be better. Perfect is the enemy of done. Perfect is the enemy of good. And it's a flexible ideology. And that's why it's so infuriating seeing liberals online think that communists are being so dogmatic because it's honestly one of the least dogmatic ideologies that exists. There's a few core principles you got to stick to ensure people aren't exploited in mass. But from there, it basically operates off of this understanding that it's going to be hard to dismantle things that already exist and it's going to be hard to work towards your future goals, but you just got to try. And in trying, you make progress. And that's something that's the opposite of capitalism. Capitalism is all about instilling the fear of change, right? Reinforcing the status quo. And and even as we do that, we see that things do change. They change for the worse. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Systems are falling apart, right? And the only things that were inspiring these capitalist countries to implement social safety measures that actually improved the quality of life for people was when we had a thriving USSR to compete with. And once the USSR fell, suddenly our infrastructure projects fell. Now our infrastructure is crumbling. Now bridges are collapsing. Everything is falling apart because the main goal of capitalism is status quo. It is not improvement. It is if change happens, it only happens for the worse. And like, yeah, so I think it's really important for people to understand that not only is it realistic to have like a Marxist revolution, it's so realistic that the United States government invests billions and billions and billions of dollars every single year trying to discourage people from wanting it. And it's so realistic that where it has been implemented, there have been concrete positive changes every single place that we can statistically point to. And the only way to deny those is to fall for State Department talking points, and they're easy to debunk. So I think that's like the most important thing for people to remember. Like, one, an alternative system is possible. Everybody thinks it's possible, including the US government. That's why they're so afraid of it. And two, we know concretely it is better. It does better. And nobody's telling you it's perfect. Nothing has to be perfect to be worthwhile to pursue, though.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's just that so many left communists or anarchists or Trotskyists, they don't realize it, but the way they've been trained within West and Western communists and anarchists, all these leftist moves have been trained, they find capitalism a lot more tolerable than socialism. They find capitalism and neoliberalism and what have you a lot more tolerable for a country to be in than a USSR or a PRC or, a DPRK type system. They have been trained to hate these systems more than capitalism or neoliberalism. And it's just a mindset you really have to get out of. And that's not to say you can't criticize these systems. Like I'm in a lot of Maoist reading groups right now, and I have dialogues with them about the current day PRC. And, I see where they get their points from. And sometimes even I find myself agreeing, like, you know what? China shouldn't be funding anti-guerrilla, communist guerrilla organizations in the Philippines or India. Like I totally understand where they're getting their ideas from. But so much of the left within the Western world they would much rather a country remain capitalist, neoliberal, in poverty than ever do a fake socialism, a quote unquote fake socialism, or socialism not the right way. They would rather you stay forever within this oppressive capitalist system than do socialism the quote unquote wrong way, the way I don't like it. And they don't even realize that some points that they are the Fed's favorite, like, socialist. Like if I was in the CIA, my favorite socialist would be an anarchist or a Bordigist or what have you. Like all of these are my favorite communists. Like I am online when I'm posting shit, I'm posting through their lenses. Like I'm not posting through the person saying the DPRK is awesome or whatever, what have you.
Right. And I mean, I think that like my transition from anarchism to just being like, nah, I'm a Marxist, like fuck all the anarchism shit. There was like a stop in leftcom, and like the stop in leftcom along the way actually did influence like a lot of how our business runs. And I will say like Anthony Pankowick is really instrumental actually in how our business structure is established. And I think there is utility in some of those ideas because
Mhm.
Panakoic in particular talked about the uniqueness of a workplace where there is like a skilled artisan needing support. And that was kind of the approach that happened with our workplace because I have a background in apparel design, because I have this like background of years and years and years of doing this. And people who come to work at our company don't necessarily have that skill. And his writing was instrumental a lot in the workshop quote unquote egalitarian model that happens within our four walls. But just like I told you like earlier, like my business exists as a coping mechanism to survive capitalism. It is not inherently revolutionary. And that's where you see the limitations of those like left communist ideas, or it's like, oh, these are great principles to apply in my household within the four walls of my little company. But these are ultimately not ideologies that threaten power structures and threaten people with real concrete tangible power. Like you said, that would be the CIA's favorite kind of leftist, right? Is one that thinks that every revolutionary attempt throughout history has led to oppression and violence. And it took me actually seeing the limitation of those ideas in practice and seeing what they could not change, what they could not alter, that they could not alter market conditions, that they could not alter the companies we interact with, for example, and how exploitative some of them can be or are not. And it took all of that for me to realize like, I used to even have this production idea in my head that production was more ethical if I could do it in Los Angeles. And the more experience I had with that, because of maybe my anarchist background, I didn't even realize how much bias and bigotry I was bringing to Chinese production. And when I got to the point where I was like, strip away all my baggage of existing in like a liberal capitalist society, strip it all away and think about what I really want practically, materially. I want improved conditions for people living their lives. And that's when you look at those figures and you're like, well, everywhere Marxist Leninists have been in power, these things have materially improved. Okay, got it. I want people working in the factories that make our clothes because I don't own a factory. I can't afford a factory. That's fucking so much money. I want them to have a good quality of life. I want them to have good pay. I want them to be able to own a home. I want them to have a fuck ton of paid time off. And you look where around the world, that's a reality where people have this, ability to produce in this really major and inspiring way. It's fucking China. And that's when I really was like, why do I think all this bad shit about China when I look at Chinese production and they have a 90% home ownership rate in China? They have months of paid time off. February, all of February, China's closed for business. Everybody has paid time off for the entire month. And that doesn't even count their normal paid vacation time. You like look at all these things and you're like, why have I been so like opposed, even in my head, as somebody who considers myself left wing and even consider myself a communist? Why did I ever have that pushback? And you're right, it is baggage. It's liberal baggage left over in your head that you have to be constantly trying to deconstruct. And there's still shit that I stumble across that I didn't even realize was like a sticking point from liberal shit that I have to unlearn. And that's the thing about being a Marxist is like you have to unlearn so much all the time. And it's a constant process. And that doesn't mean you have to think these places are perfect because nothing is perfect, but like you have to be open to the idea of progress. And so many people I think aren't, and they don't even realize they're not.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's just so many. movements that will say like, oh, like, the USSR was state capitalist, and it's like, how could you even say that? Like, you couldn't even buy you couldn't even buy things in the USSR. You didn't have the right to sell things in the USSR. You didn't even have, and like, honestly, like the dogmatic Marxists and like the anarchists that call the USSR a state capitalist, they're the CIA's favorite, like kind of people. It's just very hard for people to get out of these little biases that have been given to them. And ultimately, the goal is to turn you into an anti-communist communist. Like, if the two options you have currently under America, that America wants you, or Western world or capitalism, what have you, is to either become one, a reluctant Democrat, like you were saying, like somebody who, oh, I hate the Democratic Party. I hate everything it stands for, but I'm forced to vote for it. Or, to a dogmatic, a Marxist that like reads Marx in such a way that, you cannot even build anything ever. And everything that ever gets built to you is just fake Marxism. And I can do it the right way, but you'll never actually be able to do it the right way. Or, like an anarchist that, opposes it. And I think it really goes down to, in the West, we have a very different system of capitalism than they do in the global south, right? Like the people in the Congo are facing a very different capitalism than us, and the people in Congo know what to do immediately in order to get power, in order to establish socialism in a way that we're allowed to be a lot more idealistic in America in terms of how we can envision implementing in socialism. And partly, I think it is because if we were to implement in socialism in America, we could immediately get rid of the commodity form or commodity production, right? Like we could jump to a much higher level of socialism than somebody in the global south, which leads to these idealistic expropriations where you push that idea onto a very underdeveloped country, and you say like, why can't you get rid of it? Like, why don't you just hit the turn off the commodity production button? And it's just, uh, Western Marxism exists in a ridiculousness where it rejects pragmatism. And I understand, pragmatic arguments sometimes are not the end all be all. Like, you should be able to criticize things like China trading with Israel. I do that all the time. I don't like that China trades with Israel. But if you do too much book worship, you end up not a communist. You end up an idealist. I'm so sorry to say that, but
I mean, it's
yeah,
true.
yeah.
You shouldn't be sorry to say it. It is true. And like, I think that this is one of the things that I really realized, like, on that journey from leaving anarchism behind and just like embracing like vanguard style Marxism is like, what is the point of being a Marxist in theory if I'm not going to support any of the Marxist material projects that have happened around the world? Who does this benefit? Who is this for? And I realized it's still an individualistic thing where you can pat yourself on the back for being the one good Marxist. And it's like, who is this fucking materially helping? This materially helps nobody. And the whole point of Marxism is that it's supposed to be something that materially improves people's lives, like concrete things you can point to that get better. And nothing gets better when you are only a communist in theory and not in practice. And that's one of the things, like, I deal with like a lot of criticism on the internet. Everybody's like, you're not really a communist, you're not really a Marxist. And one of the things I've noticed is like, well, the people with the hammers and the sickles in their name aren't the ones saying that. It's the people with the blue hearts, it was the people who used to have the palm trees and the coconuts. It's the liberals who want to tell you that you're doing Marxism wrong. They've never fucking read Marxism. They've never looked at this shit. They don't know what they're talking about. And what you really start to realize is that the communists are the ones who are a lot more flexible and a lot more realistic and a lot more grounded in reality. And they're not the ones who exist usually in this like hyper idealized state because they just want material improvement in the conditions of people's lives. They're the ones fighting for actual material positive change in the world, even if it's incremental. And I think that's ironic because so many of liberals are like, you guys exist in this fantasy world. Like, we're out here fighting for pragmatic change by voting Democrat because that gives us power. And you look and you're like, it hasn't materially changed like anything, like at all.
Mm.
And it's so interesting that they get to position themselves as being the pragmatic ones in favor of incremental change and slow progress. Where you're like, no, you've just supported a slow descent, like where the Democratic Party is like, well, how much more conservative can we get away with being? How much more can we say fuck them and they still follow us, And like in my lifetime, I think probably because I went from protesting Dick Cheney's policies to watching the Democrats applaud him on a stage or whatever, that I'm like, whoa, that happened fast. That's what that supposed pragmatic approach that liberalism leaves you with gets you. It gets you nowhere. It gets you anti-progress. It gets you backwards. And then you look at what Marxists actually are in favor of, and it's like, no, we're the ones in favor of incremental small change. We just have a plan to get to the big picture, you know? And that's the thing. It's like liberalism is this plotless idea that you drive around in your car and you try not to hit people, right? And like Marxism is the idea that you've got a destination and you're working on getting there, but it's a hell of a trip, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, no, no, that's such a great analogy. And yes, I mean, I think you are absolutely right. Like liberalism, as much as it's positions itself as damage control, and not changing the status quo and keeping it at least there, so we can like slowly soften the effects of fascism. In fact, if anything, liberalism over these past few decades has been pushing us towards fascism. It has been the ideology of change towards fascism as much as possible, and you don't get any more fascist than facilitating a genocide. And when you're at the point where you're saying damage control in the face of a genocide, you really have nothing left to for your ideology to stand on. Um, and I think what liberals don't realize is that as much as they talk about pragmatism, they're actually the ultimate idealists, right? Like there is no material analysis for them for how fascism gets into power, what causes fascism, what is class society, what do the Democrats represent. For them, it's just if every 4 years we can vote blue no matter who, we can avert a fascist takeover of the government. And it's such an infantile way of looking at the world where, you don't even look at how, for example, Hitler got into power. How did Hitler get into power? He was appointed into power by von Hindenburg. And von Hindenburg, I hate to say it, was 100 times more to the left of Kamala Harris. So if Hitler can get into power through von Hindenburg, even though everybody voted for von Hindenburg, voting for Kamala sure as fuck wasn't going to stop us devolving towards fascism. Ultimately, I think liberals don't understand the social basis of fascism, which is the irrecoverable contradictions of capitalism and a safe face for the system of capitalism. And they just simply think that if everybody can think like a Democrat, right? Like if everybody gets out of their quote unquote stupid, selfish, thought processes and they just learn to think like a Democrat and they vote for a Democrat, we can overcome fascism. But voting a Democrat doesn't stop the irrevocable laws of capitalism, right? Like there's laws of capitalism that are hard baked into it that no voting in a Democrat can ever solve. And so their pragmatist arguments so often just fall flat to anybody who has a good structural analysis, right? What they want to do is simply just put a black face or a woman's face on her descent into fascism rather than actually ever stop fascism. It is totally that disconnect between materialism and idealism, with liberalism representing a total idealism as much as it wants to act like it's a materialistic ideology.
Right. It is the ultimate idealism. And you'll find that, yeah, Marxists are the ones who actually want pragmatic, tangible, real change. And you'll see that anytime you see a liberal attempt to critique a Marxist country, when they try to critique the USSR, when they try to critique China, when they critique the DPRK, it is this hyper idealistic critique, you know? And then you compare it to what they're willing to capitulate to here in the United States and what they think is okay. And you'll find that the only way you can think the United States uh, is all right or would be all right under Democratic leadership or whatever is if you completely ignore the material reality of what's going on. And that's why I think it's so interesting when liberals are like, well, why do you focus so much on what Democrats are doing? And it's like, well, why don't you want people knowing what they're doing? You know, like when I talk about like immigration, for example, and I'm like, yeah, Democrats are worse on immigration historically in my lifetime, in my adulthood, than Republicans are. And people get so mad when you point that out. And it's because it fractures the idealism of their vantage point, where they suddenly have to confront the fact that like, no, voting blue no matter who doesn't get you that idealistic world you're pretending exists. And this is the material reality. And they don't have a framework to deal with that because they don't actually care about progress or actual change or improvement in people's lives, and they just care about the optics. That's all they care about. And it's very, very fascinating how many people here in the United States in the imperial core are comfortable trading the literal lives of people in other countries for, minor comforts here at home. For because they're not major grand, comforts amazing even. Quality it's not even like we're selling out American. the
It's
lives
for
of
these really
innocent people
small,
around the
fucked up
globe
little
every single
concessions.
like one of the things I think about a lot, because I voted for Barack Obama. And I remember this. And I remember not expecting much because I was already a socialist at this point. I was already calling myself a Marxist. I was already a communist, right? And I was like, "Yeah, I'll vote for Barack Obama. Maybe we'll get universal health care." And it's not like I think universal health care would have saved the world, right? It would have been like one of those things like, well, maybe we will. Every other capitalist country with some sort of wealth manages to have universal health care. It's not enough, but it's something. And that might be cool, right? And I remember I voted for Barack Obama and then was shocked when universal health care didn't happen. I remember that check in with myself being like, holy shit, like you call yourself a communist and you were shocked the Democrat didn't actually deliver universal health care? Like, you're so gullible. And that was my idealism. And I'm like, fuck, I fell for it, you know? Like, here I am thinking I'm even above it, but I'll vote for the guy because why not? Maybe something good will happen. And then I'm surprised when he continues to be a Democrat existing under capitalism. Like, oh man. And that's like really when you start to recognize the liberalism in yourself is when you allow yourself to be a little idealistic and you're like, why would that happen under the system? Of course, that wouldn't fucking happen under the system. And going along with that is like an extra punch in the face is that he was supposed to codify Roe v. Wade. He got the Planned Parenthood endorsement his first election cycle, right? Because he said he was going to codify Roe v. Wade. And it comes time to codify Roe v. Wade when he's in office. And he literally released a press release being like, yeah, it's not a priority right now. And you see these things and you're like, oh man, it is. Liberalism is the idealistic perspective. And the only way you can maintain that idealism is if you completely deny reality and live in fantasy land in the clouds. And even as somebody who called myself a communist, I'm like, oh shit, I was still even living in fantasy land in the clouds. Because I knew Democrats were useless, but I thought maybe we'd get abortion and health care. And that was even foolish to ask for, right? So yeah, I think that's like a very interesting point about how liberals are able to present themselves as being pragmatic, but they are the ultimate idealists. I think that is true.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think the problem with American liberals is they don't understand how we got any of the rights that we got in America. And it wasn't through voting, it was through militant communist struggles, right? Like the people of Europe who have social democracies, the reason they have social democracies is because first of all, the Soviet Union was there, and the Soviet Union was absolutely terrifying to the rulers of Europe. But not only that, the communist parties of Europe and the communist parties of America struggled so hard to get us just the most basic rights that we enjoy under our current governments. And in America, they're barely anything. And I don't understand the arguments that we had to sacrifice the Palestinians in order to enjoy our rights. It's not like we're living in like Switzerland where we have free college and free healthcare, where, okay, you know what, that's kind of an argument. I don't agree with it, but I could see why you would want to preserve that and make like an argument that we have to protect this. All we have in America is maybe like Social Security at best, just the most bare bone basic rights. But even these rights, the only reason they were won was because of militant communists in the 30s, during the Great Depression, because of the militant organization of the civil rights leaders in the 60s and 70s. Voting never got us these. And that's so hard for liberals to understand, is that voting doesn't get you these rights. What gets you these rights is going out in the streets. You doing a labor strike or a protest is 100 times more effective, will be 100 times more effective than ever voting in Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris for 100 years.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's like the thing too, when people are always mad at me because like of how I voted, because I voted for Claudia de la Cruz. And I think it's so funny because I'm like, I mean, I registered Peace and Freedom Party when I was 18, and people think that I was like out there trying to influence the election, and I'm like, I don't even believe elections get you anything. Why would I spend my time trying to influence how people vote? I honestly don't give a fuck how you vote. I don't think it's going to make a difference. It's not going to get me the society I want. It's not going to get you the society you want. Why would I invest my time trying to influence how you vote? Like that just feels so silly. And that's what people don't understand. That's what liberals don't understand. And they're like, you really wanted everybody to not vote for Kamala Harris. And I'm like, I literally don't care because I don't think it would have made a difference. That's not my political goals have nothing to do with voting. I'm not going to vote my way into anything that actually is useful. And you're totally right. The things we do have here are the result of previous efforts of militant communists or in gay rights. It's like we don't even really have a lot of federally protected gay rights. And the ones we do have, like especially here in California, it's been like militant gays, like militant gay action, not like we voted for it, yay. That's not how this fucking works. And it's just very, very fascinating to me that the trade-off that's being presented doesn't even exist, right? The idea that, well, you just vote in a way where you just deal with the foreign policy of the United States government because it makes life better for people here at home. And you're like, it actually fucking doesn't even make life better for people here at home. Like, oh, what are like maybe abortion access kind of. But again, you see, it's like, well, Barack Obama has no reason why he didn't codify Roe v. Wade. And it's because that's how they convince you to vote for Democrats. Like it's not actually materially improving, like at all.
The reason we even got Roe v. Wade in the first place was because there were a lot of radical feminist movements in the 70s. I mean, without them, we wouldn't have gotten Roe v. Wade ever. And I think that's just so hard for liberals to understand is that the ballot box doesn't do shit. Like, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's not fucking doing anything. Like, when, like the one thing materially that happened because of voting in my life, actually two things, and they both happened in San Francisco. One was we got a city health insurance for service workers.
Mm.
That was pretty cool. And then the second thing is that they renamed the sewage treatment plant after George W. Bush. And I'm like, that is the perfect summary of the liberal agenda. If you want to know why so many liberals in California don't like the Democrat, or why so many, left wing people in California don't like the liberals, don't like the Democratic Party, it's because that's what it gets you. It gets you service workers now can pay to have health insurance, not even a universal healthcare experience. You're like, okay. And we renamed a sewage treatment plant after a Republican. Ha ha, that's funny. It's just optics. You're like, this isn't what like what's the point of this? Like, what did this get us?
Yeah. I mean, when you're voting, you might as well just throw your ballot in the trash can. It's about as effective. I will say, George Bush sewage treatment plant, that is funny. That is very funny. Yeah.
It's a good bit. It's a good bit. And the funny thing too is I'm like, I have voted in every single election since I was 18 years old. And I've never been a person who thought voting was going to change anything. And I told you, even like the Barack Obama thing, I was like, yeah, it's not going to do anything, whatever. But I was still shocked. I was like, damn, I knew it wasn't going to do anything. But part of me still thought maybe it would do like this much, like the
Mm.
teeniest bit of something. No, of course, it was fucking stupid. I can't even believe that somewhere in the back of my head that still existed. I thought that part of me didn't exist. And when I felt the disappointment, I was like, oh, I was actually optimistic. What the fuck is wrong with me? But it's like I do it anyway because I don't know, it's easy. Why the fuck not just do it? I guess. I think it's because I like homework. It's because I'm really good at homework. So when somebody's like, "Here's an assignment," I'm like, "Oh yeah, okay, I'll do that assignment. Yeah, it'll be great." But yeah, just it's not. It's never. There's no like. There's very very little delusion there that it's ever going to change fucking anything. So yeah, this idea that the liberals that's more of like the liberal idealism that like if you just vote hard enough, it's all gonna fall into place, despite having absolutely no historical evidence of that
Absolutely.
whatsoever.
Anytime there's an election, I always like sort of like employ like a really Diane mentality. Cause like if you've ever watched like BoJack Horseman, there's this one scene where Diane, she's talking to a billionaire and she's like, "Oh, well, this bill won't pass the Senate." And the billionaire's like, "Really, Diane? Well, the judiciary will stop it. Really, Diane?" Like, it's just this you really expect the system to stop it. And every single time there's a law and people are online and they're like, or like people are around me in my circle are saying like, well, it's gaining traction, this horrible law that'll take away our rights. But if the Supreme Court can just, and that's when the really Diane just goes off in my head. I mean, you do have to sort of employ that mentality that of always distrust, of always just pessimism, because the checks and balances in the American government are never going to stop them taking away our rights. Like it's gonna pass the House, it's gonna pass the Senate, it's gonna pass the judiciary, it's gonna pass the whatever, the local guy who was like in the middle, who like whatever, like he throws a ball and if it lands in the box, the law goes, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. Like whatever checks and balances we have, they always get bypassed in order to for the interest of capitalism. That's what I'm trying
Exactly.
to say. Yeah.
I think the best example of this is seeing that, the Democrats spent so much time trying to convince the American public that the Republicans were fascists, not them, the Democrats. The Republicans definitely, though. Oh my God, it's going to be like Hitler. It's going to be so bad. It's going to be horrible, blah, 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 blah. And then you're like, okay, so you're not going to approve any of Donald Trump's like appointments then, right? Like the people that he's appointing, you cannot approve them. That's part of the supposed checks and balances systems. No, of course not. They approve every single one. And the only time anything gets pushed back is when US aid is gonna get cut. And I'm like, are you kidding? They're like, whoa, 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 don't cut our imperial neo-colonial death machine. How dare you do that? And then like the one senator or whatever is like, I refuse to confirm any of Trump's appointments until US aid is funded again. And you're like, that tells you right there. That's what they'll go to bat for. They'll go to bat for fucking US aid, but they won't go to bat for you. They don't give a fuck because they work for the same people and the same people are invested in keeping you, overworked, underpaid, heavily exploited, unable to afford your rent, and forced to purchase health insurance that doesn't even cover the cost of your medical bills. Like it's all a big fucking racket, you know?
Yeah, we had a really Diane moment recently with like Chuck Schumer. Like, oh my God, Chuck Schumer's gonna stop Trump's spending bill, and I was just saying the whole time, really, Diane? Like, it's just a universal thing that you can apply to everything. Uh,
Yeah.
moving on. You were mentioning it before, but you have been canceled, quote unquote, canceled on TikTok
So many
many
times.
times. Yeah,
All the time, every week now, basically. I look forward to a weekly cancellation round about it. Yeah.
yeah, you've been into so many controversies. Why do you think you are such a liberal linchpin? They hate you with a fury. There's just something about you that gets them. I personally think it's the Central Valley girl accent. Like that, a lot of people aren't used to it who aren't in the valley. Like it sounds a little bit condescending to anybody who hasn't heard it before.
Okay, I do have this like brought it out more. I'm like, yeah, oh my God, okay, I'll have a theory about it. Do you really want to talk about it? Okay, here's the thing. So one day I was on TikTok and like this thing pops up on my For You page, and it's this guy, and he's like, liberal, sorry, leftists aren't like us, man. Like, I'm not calling myself a leftist anymore. And behind him is this like nine grid he's made of like nine prominent communists on TikTok. And I'm in there and I'm like, oh my God, hey, there's me. I look cute. Okay. Um, Everybody else though in that grid is not white, right? And I think about this a lot because communism is a liberation ideology. It appeals to colonized people, it appeals to oppressed people. It's a liberation ideology. And I look at that and that really I was like, okay, so the liberal mindset is so focused on identity politics, right? That all these white Democrats, these vote blue no matter who liberals, they're not going to go after the communists of color. They can't because it violates their identity politics optics, right? So when I looked at it and I was like, they can go after me. I'm safe, right? I'm one of them. Like, oh, I'm like white and I'm middle class, right? And they're like, oh, this is someone I can take down though within the framework of liberal identity politics. It's like a fair fight to them, right? So I think that's why they kind of started seizing on me because within that framework of liberal identity politics, I was considered the easiest target because most of the other prominent communists they're black, they're brown, they're disabled. They come from all these walks of life. They're not Americans. It's hard for an American white comfortable Democrat liberal to be able to comfortably take on and fight because what language are you going to throw at them that looks good, right?
Mm.
It can't. It's not going to appeal to other liberals if you do that. Other liberals are going to be like, "Oh, I don't know if I can get behind that." But for me, it feels like a fair fight for them to come after me because we come from the same kind of place, because we look the same, because we're in probably the same income bracket, right? It feels like a fair fight to take me on. And I think that's like a really funny byproduct of all of it. And I made a video once before. I was like, I mean, it's also the reason why I've been comfortably able to exist as a communist online for so long because like the federal government fears black communism, fear brown communism, right? Because these have been in the United States the movements that have gained a lot of traction and success, like the Black Panthers, right? Obviously. So they don't really fear like a random middle class white person in Los Angeles making videos on their phone. It's like I'm not gonna what am I gonna fucking do? They murdered Fred Hampton for a reason, right? I'm not a threat like Fred Hampton was because the federal government fears the most marginalized and oppressed people in society rising up against it. They feared like the black messiah that would unite the black and white working classes together and overcome that kind of identity politics division. Like that's what they fear. And and so for me, I think that I present like this weird exception in communism. Because when you go to like IRL organizing, like how many middle class white people do you see there? It's not the dominant people in the room because, if communism is a liberation ideology, the people it appeals to the most are the people, usually in the most dire need of liberation, the people who have experienced enough to know that this system is fucking all of us. And there is this like liberal white idea of comfort where, like you said, like earlier, like people don't want to give up their comfort, right? To protest something. They're like, what if the quality of life gets worse? My quality of life is kind of okay in this system. And it's part of like when we look at like conditions like racialization, which is something like the power structure does to us. It racializes us to divide us. Like that's after Bacon's rebellion in the United States. That's when we first started seeing different laws applying to black people versus white people, who were poor, who were, exploited, right, to try to pit us against each other and make us not come together. So I think all of these elements of identity politics play into it. And the same thing that makes me not threatening to the power structure also makes me an easy target, I think, for white liberals. They understand me and they know that within the framework of liberal identity politics that they have created, I'm a safe target. And it's silly, I think, in a lot of ways. I don't think it's a problem. I don't think it's, they're like, what are they going to do? Come for Samaya? It's not a good look. And Samaya's fucking brilliant. And I love a lot of Samaya's critiques and Samaya's analysis. These are people I'm learning from too. And that's why I just try to tell people, like, okay, if we're going to play into the identity politics game, you don't have to learn this shit from me. If you don't want to listen to a white person teach you about politics in the United States, that's fine. That's totally fine. You don't have to. Luckily, there are lots of people from different types of backgrounds who are eager to talk to you about communism, about Marxism, about socialism, and you can hear it from them. You definitely 100% do not have to hear it from me. But yeah, so I think that's why I bear the brunt of it. I think they're angry at being forced to confront their own hypocrisy, their own moral failings.
Mm.
And I think that anger for it to come out in a way that doesn't look like they're punching down, I'm the easiest target on the internet that they see. Like,
Yeah, yeah, I think it's there's the liberal understanding, and me and Lex Loser talk about this a lot, our mutual friend, but
yeah,
it's just that the liberal understanding of identity is so odd, where like they'll say stupid ass shit like, well, Marx was a white man, like Marx was a dead old white man. I don't need to listen to him. Um, and it's like, look, your understanding of identity is class reductionist. And there's two different ways to look at identity that I think are wrong deviations. And one is class reductionist where like or no class reductionist is the other one, but like one is like where you're purely identity, and you look at purely identity, you don't even look at the character, what people are saying, or class relations, or the system. And it's just like, well, if a person of color is saying it, it's great, right? So Kamala Harris is so girl boss queen, ultimate awesome. I love her. And so you just got to shut up and listen to her, honey, and let her bomb Palestinian kids. That's the one way of looking at it. That's a liberal deviation. And then there's also the class reductionist way of looking at it, where it's like, oh man, all that matters is class, and forget about being black or Mexican or LGBTQ. And I'm not going to recognize the intersectionalities of how these people are treated differently under capitalism. And that's the other wrong deviation. But the way you have to look at class, it's intersectionality. You have to look at class and identity together, and I think liberals fail to do that ultimately. And that's how they're able to say, Marx was a white man, why do I have to listen to him? Well, Isaac Newton was a white man, but you still believe in the laws of physics, right? Like, it's not the what Isaac Newton's whiteness didn't take away from his theoretical discoveries. And in the same way, what, Madeline is a white person, yeah, sure, but what she's saying is right. Like that's so hard for them to understand. And they also will eat up black communists. They will also eat up communists of color by saying like, you don't care about black people, or you're a fake black person, you're a fake person of color, or it's just the liberal understanding of identity is awful. That's all I can say, right? Yeah.
for what I've seen, I don't know for other people, but what I've seen in other people's comment section is like, okay, if you're a black communist, it appears to be that black liberals are the ones coming for you. It's not white liberals coming for you, telling you, I mean, probably they do it too, I would guess,
Mm.
but it's not going to be a lot of white liberals telling you you're not a real black person. Probably would be my guess. But on for me, it's a lot of white Democrats. It's like they finally found a place where they could be angry at those damn pesky leftists, and it's me. So I would say it's disproportionately white liberals and white Democrats who are just like full rage mode on my page. And then it's like maybe 3 liberals of color who made some videos who were like, "I don't like this." And then it's like they got the green light from liberals who have some sort of identity that they can tokenize to just launch onto me in some major way. So, it's like a very, very fascinating thing to watch happen. It's almost like, they're I don't know, they're just like they don't even know what they're mad at. They're being pointed in a direction and they're just going. But that's funny. I saw Lex Luthor and I are both in candidacy stage currently for the same organization. So I just saw him 2 weeks ago, week before last at one of the meetings.
Nice, nice.
Yeah, yeah, it's cool. But
Yeah,
yeah,
no,
it's interesting. I think that's why I'm canceled though. I think that and also I speak with authority on things I know, and they don't like that. And they want you also there's this whole thing about accountability. They're like, you never say you're sorry, you never back down. And like I'm not gonna do that if I'm not wrong about something. And they really don't like that. I think if I had been a professional content creator and this was like my main source of money, there would be different kind of PR focused ways I would have to handle this. And I think that's what people expect from me. And I think it really infuriates them when I'm like, no, I'm not wrong. I'm not going to apologize for something I didn't say or do. Absolutely not. Not getting a notes app apology for me. I'm not going to cry in a fucking video. Like, I'm not handling this influencer style because I'm not a fucking influencer. That's not my job. And I think that infuriates people too because they feel like they don't have control over me in a lot of ways because of that, because my income's not tied to them and what they think about me or say about me on the internet.
yeah, I mean, the depths of the controversies are really they've really shocked me too. I mean, just watching them from the sidelines. I mean, if you're okay with it, I like to read
Oh,
something.
yeah.
I won't tribute. Yeah, but there's this one
Go for it.
article that came out about you, and it said like, I do not doubt that Madeline keeps a quiver full of black people who agree with her in her vicinity. But in many ways, she still is the sort of person who grabs her purse tight when she walks by a black person on the street. And I think that was like the most that's the most like ridiculous character assassination of anybody without like any it's not even rooted in anything. It's just like a complete assumption. I think I don't know. It's
But
just
that's the kind of stuff
ridiculous.
they do all the time. That's why I tell people, I'm like, "You're writing fanfic, babe. You just made up a whole fanfic about me. You don't fucking know me. Like, you don't know anything about me." And the funniest part too is like, I can't even take this shit seriously because it's so the opposite of me. Like sometimes I'll get like comments that are like, "Oh, here come the white woman tears," and I'm like, you don't know me. My problem in society is not that I break down and cry when confronted. It's that I come out swinging too much. Like, I was arrested for assaulting a police officer. Like, I was kicked out of all of my high school classes because I was physically threatening to my teachers. Like, I was not allowed to do PE because there was a specific part of PE that involved holding something that my PE coach thought I might use as a weapon and harm somebody. So it's like this total, like, they've created this fake version of me online. Earlier today, some people in my comment section and I were joking. There's like a Madeline Villenton that's like not based in reality at all. And like I've gone through my life like dealing with these rage issues, these hostility issues, like these issues where I don't back down from fights, where I'm too aggressive. And like that's the shit I try to work on as a person. So then to go on the internet and be like, you paint yourself as a victim all the time. This is what people say about me. And I'm like, you're writing fanfic. Like, you don't fucking know me. And that's like not my shit. That's not my problem. That's not my thing. That's the person you've crafted in a situation to be upset about. But like, that's not me. And I can't get upset over that because that's not me. Like the thing about clutching your purse tight when you're walking down the street. Like, first of all, I don't look like I have shit worth taking. I'm not worried about somebody robbing me. Okay. And like, second of all, if somebody did try to rob me, I would probably go down screaming and like fucking start a fist fight over it. Like I'm just not a clutch your pearls kind of person in general, and especially not in a way that where I'm going to think that black people are disproportionately more likely to rob me. Like this is just so like a made up scenario. Like you said, it's totally not grounded in reality. It's completely made up. But
Mhm.
it also denies like who I am as a person too, where I'm like, not only did you invent a whole fake racism that's not there, on top of that, you invented a whole Madeline's afraid of the world that's not there because you don't know me. And I think like that is really the crux of like all the cancellations. It's not about who I actually am or what I've actually done. It's about this idea that like the online liberal mob has created of an ultimate villain that they want to take down. And it's Madeline Villenton. It's not me. It's this fake thing that doesn't exist. So it is really interesting. And that's why I think it's so funny. Like all the reasons people cancel me, how they're totally made up and not real. Like And I'm kind of surprised they keep trying. At this point, you'd think something would come up if I was actually a secretly fucking evil person, and they can never find anything. They have to invent things. Like another really funny example is when they thought I was a landlord because I helped my friend buy a house.
Mm.
This one was super, super funny to me. Um, and I've like seen a little bit of the stuff on Reddit, and it's kind of sad because the thing everybody comes back to is that I can't actually be paying people the same wages as me or like using my book advance to help buy a friend a house because they're like, well, who would do that? And I'm like, damn, you just outed yourself as a bad person, man. I don't know anybody who, if they came into a large sum of money and somebody who'd been close to them for 16 years of their life was about to get evicted, wouldn't help them secure housing. Like, who are you hanging around with? You know, where I come from, that's what you would do. And so it's very, very fascinating to see these people like invent these fake scenarios and just latch onto them, and it's pure speculation. Like I saw somebody today make a whole video where they speculated I made $130,000 from book sales because they just took the average price of a book and multiplied it by 5,000 copies. And I'm like, did you forget book publishers exist? Like, how did you even come up with this shit? Like, you're just spouting random bullshit. So it's very, very, very funny. I don't know. It's amusing to me because it's always so far off base, and you go through life as like an adult and you're like, I have problems in my personality I need to work on. And it's so funny being like, yeah, my problem is that I'm way too aggressive and confrontational and I get in fights too often. And then having the internet be like, your problem is that you always want to be a victim. And you're like, oh, babe, little do you know, you don't know shit over here. Like, my problem is I refuse to be a victim. And that's like its own set of weird fucking problems. But yeah, the internet cancellation stuff cracks me up because it's just people who know me in real life are always like, "What the fuck is happening here?" And I'm like, "Who fucking knows?" Like, who knows?
Yeah. I also think it's just the nature of TikTok discourse also, like the stitching and the stitching and the stitching. It leads to a game of telephone where, like it'll lead to these myths being created or like somebody misunderstands something somebody else said. Like there was one that was going around that was like Madeline called fuck, what's her name? Angela Davis. Madeline called Angela Davis a Fed or like a federal agent. And these videos were getting like tens or 20,000 likes. And I'm like, where did they even get this from? Like, and I think it was like you said something like, "Oh, I don't really agree with Angela Davis's current day policies on the Democrats," or something like that, or something similar like that. And it got mistranslated into Angela Davis is literally a federal agent, and I hate black people, or something ridiculous, you know?
No, you know what it actually was? Is I was like, oh yeah, like Angela Davis was part of this specific type of communist party that actually does endorse Democrats, but that's not all communists. That's like a specific type of communist party.
Okay.
And then I was like, also, the Black Agenda Report has a really good breakdown of their current kind of issues with Angela Davis from a Black left wing political, perspective that maybe you guys should read. I literally showed a Black Agenda Report about Angela Davis that also did not call her a Fed, actually. That was it. That was literally it. I was like, yeah, if you want to learn more about like a good Black communist perspective on Angela Davis, I recommend this article
Yeah.
written by Black Marxists. And that was it.
Yeah, and I think what liberals don't realize is everybody within communist spaces, we all criticize Angela Davis and the American Communist, or no, what's it called? The CPUSA, and its current like democratic leadings. Like we all do that. Like it's not, and we're not doing it because Angela Davis is a person of color, because she's a Fed, or we're not claiming that she's a Fed. I mean, I think it's just liberals have a hard time understanding her discourse. Madeline, thank you so much for coming on to this podcast. Tell people where they can find you. And if you have any final words, any final messages, let them be said.
Okay, well, you guys can find me on TikTok. It's at Madeline_Pendleton, just like the wool company. And you can find me on Twitter. I'm Jean Grey, JeanGreige. And that's it. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to do a fellow Central Valley commie thing.
Yeah, of course. Of course. It's been fun. You have a good one. You have a good rest of your weekend. And I'll see you on the next Madeline cancellation,
Yes, keep up with my cancellations.
All right. Have a good
Bye.
This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you.
What the fuck? Glory to Stalin. I barely made it.
And a special shout out to our Marshal of the Soviet Union member, Matthias T. If you'd also like a shout out, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, where you can also get episodes up to a month early. Thank you.